Good evening. Tonight's story is not fiction. It's a real case, dark, unsettling, told step by step for those who remain awake when the world outside is quiet. If stories like these keep you listening, subscribe, like, and tell me where you're tuning in from. Now, lock your front door. Lie down, let the AC hum, pull the blanket close, but leave one foot uncovered. Science shows it helps your body cool down and fall asleep faster. The rain begins soft at first, tapping the glass, steady and calm. In less than 5 minutes, her familiar walk home turned into a disappearance no one could explain. It was 2 days before Christmas. The houses on the street were trimmed in colored bulbs, a soft glow under the winter mist. Inside, one small frame, house stockings already hung a tree flickering in the corner, and children's toys scattered near the couch. At 7 that morning, neighbors heard a sound, something between a crack and a roar. When they ran outside, they saw flames shooting through the windows. Within minutes, the house of Cameron Todd Willingham was engulfed in smoke. Willingham stumbled from the doorway, barefoot, shirt scorched, shouting for help. Inside, his 3 daughters were trapped, 2-year-old Amber and 1-year-old twins Carmen and Cameron. The air was black, heavy, impossible to breathe. He said later that he'd tried to reach them, but the heat threw him back each time. By the time firefighters arrived, the small home had become a furnace. Neighbors saw him collapse in the yard, screaming their names. They said the sound was not human. It was something broken. When the blaze was finally beaten down, the interior was unrecognizable. Rooms fused by heat walls collapsed, the smell of smoke and wet ash filling the air. In the middle of what used to be the children's bedroom, investigators found the remains. 3 little girls who had gone to bed beside a decorated tree and never opened their eyes again. The sight left grown men silent. A local fire marshal, eyes still watering from the smoke, whispered that he hadn't seen anything like it in years. And yet within hours, a quiet suspicion began to form. Willingham, the father who escaped with only minor burns, became the subject of whispered doubts. His wife Stacy was at a nearby thrift store buying gifts when the fire began. She came home to nothing but a smoldering skeleton of a house. She said later that Todd held her shoulders as she screamed, but his face looked far away, numb, detached. It could have been shock. It could have been guilt. The investigators didn't know which. What they did know was that something about the fire looked wrong. On the blackened floor, they noticed dark puddle-shaped marks spreading like spider legs. To them, those marks meant accelerant gasoline poured in pools and lit with purpose. Burn patterns near the door suggested multiple points of ignition. The aluminum frame of the doorway was warped underneath a sign they thought of liquid seeping down and burning from below. The word they wrote in their notebooks was deliberate. By afternoon, the whispers had become theory, and the theory was quickly turning into accusation. As the smoke cleared, the same people who had hugged him that morning began to step back. The sheriff's car idled outside for hours. Todd sat on the curb, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the shell of his house. He asked for a cigarette and a lighter, then looked at the flame for a long time before putting it out. When an investigator approached, he asked the same question again and again. "What do you think happened?" The officer didn't answer. He didn't have to. The way they were all looking at him was answer enough. By evening, word had spread. A father had survived a fire that killed his 3 children. The town divided in hours, half believing tragedy, half suspecting evil. The forensic report was still a day away, but judgment had already arrived. Reporters started calling the scene an act of unimaginable horror. The truth was more complicated. Somewhere in that ash lay either the proof of a man's guilt or the evidence of a system that was about to destroy the wrong person. Tomorrow, the investigators would return, measuring each line of char, each melted edge, convinced they were reading the story the fire had written. But they didn't realize that sometimes flames lie. By the second sunrise after the fire, the snow of ash still clung to the grass outside the Willingham home. Investigators moved through the remains, with cameras and metal rods measuring and photographing every inch. The smell of wet timber and melted plastic coated the air. They worked methodically, scraping through the soot like archaeologists exhuming a secret. Each photo they took was supposed to tell a truth, yet what they believed they saw was shaped by training that time would prove flawed. The floor was charred in irregular shapes. They called them pore patterns, convinced gasoline had been spread across the living room. A patch beneath the children's room showed deeper burns, and they marked it as a point of origin. They didn't know that the same marks appear in nearly every flashover fire. The lead investigator, a man named Manuel Vasquez, squatted near the doorway and drew a circle on the floor with a gloved hand. He whispered, "Accelerant right here." Another examiner nodded, writing it down. They didn't collect the sample until late afternoon, when the light had already begun to fade, and by then contamination was almost certain. When the chemical lab later found trace hydrocarbons, it was treated as confirmation rather than question. The report would read positive for flammable liquid, no mention that the substance could have come from household varnish or melted furniture. It was enough for a headline, enough for an arrest. Stacy stood behind the police tape, holding a grocery bag with toys she had bought just hours before the fire. Inside were a doll, a small blanket, and wrapping paper patterned with snowmen. She refused to leave. The chief offered to drive her home, but she shook her head. She said she needed to see. Her face was pale, lips trembling, eyes fixed on what used to be her front door. Neighbors gathered in whispers. Someone said they'd seen Todd moving his car while the house was still burning. Someone else said he didn't cry. Every word was another nail in the coffin of doubt. The human mind craves explanation, and grief too raw becomes suspicion too quickly. That night, the sheriff's office called Todd back for questioning. He arrived wearing a borrowed shirt, hands still bandaged. They asked him to describe everything he'd done that morning. He spoke quietly, eyes down, repeating that he woke up to Amber's screams and smoke. The detectives pressed harder. "Why didn't you go back inside?" He said he tried, but the flames rolled across the ceiling. They leaned in. "Why no burns on your feet?" He hesitated, said he thought he was wearing shoes but couldn't remember. Every pause sounded guilty. They weren't looking for accident anymore. They were looking for confession. Outside television, trucks began to line the curb. The camera lights made the blackened frame of the house glow against the night. A reporter said on live broadcast that authorities suspected foul play. No one corrected her. The narrative was easier that way, a monster among us, a father turned killer. Stacy watched from her sister's couch as the story played out on screen. She covered her face and whispered that they were wrong. She said he could be cruel, could shout, could break things, but he loved those girls more than anything. Her words vanished under the noise of speculation. Inside the sheriff's office, one of the deputies wrote in his report that the suspect showed limited emotion and inconsistent affect. That phrase would echo through courtrooms years later. The truth was simpler. Trauma doesn't look the way people expect. Some people scream, others fold into silence. Todd's silence would become evidence. The investigators never considered that the burn patterns might be illusions of heat, or that the puddle-shaped scars on the floor came from flashover, the sudden ignition that makes everything combustible burn at once. They believed what decades of folklore and fire science had taught them, that V-shaped marks pointed to origin, that melted glass meant accelerant, that cracked windows proved intentional heat. It wasn't malice, it was certainty disguised as skill. When they finally released him that evening, the air outside the station was heavy with rain. Reporters shouted questions. He said nothing, only stared past them toward the courthouse lights down the street. Somewhere inside, the official paperwork was being typed, "Cause incendiary suspect father." The ink dried before the truth had a chance to speak. Forensic photographs would soon replace human memory. Each image of the charred floor, each mislabeled pattern, became another step toward a death sentence waiting years ahead. In the quiet of the motel room where he slept that night, Todd Willingham pressed his forehead to the cold window. Outside, thunder rolled across the flat Texas plain. He whispered his daughter's names like a prayer, each syllable dissolving into the storm. He didn't know that the next time he'd see their faces would be on a projection screen enlarged for a jury, framed as evidence of his guilt. In the morning, he'd wake to the sound of footsteps, officers coming back with a warrant. The courthouse smelled faintly of varnish and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to buildings where judgment never sleeps. Cameron Todd Willingham sat at the defense table, wrists chained, eyes fixed on the floor. Across from him, prosecutor John Jackson arranged files with the calm precision of a man who already believed the outcome. In small-town Texas, arson that kills children is more than a crime. It is blasphemy. The crowd filled every bench. Reporters angled their microphones toward the aisle, waiting for one image: a father condemned. Jackson began his case not with evidence but with emotion. He painted a picture of a violent man, obsessed with heavy metal music, tattoos of skulls and flames, a temper that frightened his wife. Each word built a portrait that felt more myth than man. Then came the crown piece, the testimony of a fellow inmate named Johnny Webb. The lights dimmed slightly when he entered, shackled and grinning, a thin figure whose eyes darted around the room like a moth trapped in glass. The jurors leaned forward. They wanted a story, and Webb was ready to give them one. He told the court that while sharing a cell with Willingham, he'd heard a confession. Todd, he said, admitted setting the fire to cover up an injury his wife had caused to one of the children. It was simple, horrifying, and impossible to disprove. The courtroom stilled. Webb spoke with the conviction of a man who'd rehearsed every syllable. The prosecutor nodded, his face grave as if reluctant to expose such darkness. The defense objected, calling the story fabrication, but the damage was done. Once a confession exists, even a phantom one, truth bends around it. No physical evidence tied Willingham to arson. No fingerprints on a gas can, no residue on his clothes, nothing except patterns in burned wood and the words of a convict facing his own long sentence. Later, under cross-examination, Webb admitted he had been on medication for bipolar disorder, that his memory sometimes blurred, but he held firm. "He told me he did it," he repeated. The jurors looked at him, then at the man across the room, whose expression never changed. Silence filled the gap where certainty should have lived. When the trial recessed for lunch, Jackson approached Webb in a quiet hallway. No microphones, no cameras. He thanked him, a hand briefly on his shoulder. Years later, a handwritten note would surface, suggesting that Webb had been promised leniency, a shorter sentence, maybe even early release. Both men denied it. Yet months after the verdict, Webb walked free while Willingham awaited execution. In the records, no explanation appears. In the eyes of the town, none was needed. Justice had been served. A monster had been caged. Stacy Kuykendall, Todd's estranged wife, sat through every session, clutching a tissue that never seemed to leave her hand. When the photographs of the burned nursery were displayed, she turned away, whispering her daughter's names. The jurors looked at her trembling shoulders and saw grief transformed into proof. Jackson's voice softened as he told them a father's duty is to protect. He paused, letting the silence preach. Then he said he chose fire. The words lingered like smoke. Behind the defense table, Willingham's attorney tried to fight science with logic, explaining how flashover could mimic arson, how burn patterns mislead, how an innocent man could be destroyed by myth. But reason rarely wins against emotion. The prosecution had a confession, a grieving mother, and pictures of 3 tiny coffins. By the time closing arguments began, the verdict was already written. When the jury foreman rose, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "Guilty," he said. The word echoed once, twice, like the closing of a cell door. In the next phase, they would decide whether the sentence would be life or death. Todd stared straight ahead, unmoving, as if the body left behind on that wooden chair belonged to someone else. Outside, reporters shouted questions into the humid air. Why did he do it? what drove him. None of them asked whether he might not have done it at all. Years later, Johnny Webb would sit in a diner with a journalist and admit that maybe he was mistaken. He said he'd been under heavy medication, that memories blurred like smoke through glass. "I think I was wrong," he whispered. But by then the system had already done its work. A confession cannot be unspoken once it feeds the machine. In court records, in television specials, in the minds of strangers, the story remained a father who burned his children. And for the men who built that story, there was no turning back. Too many careers, too many headlines, too much faith in a lie. The sentencing phase began on a Thursday morning, the air outside heavy with the scent of wet asphalt. The courthouse crowd was smaller now, just family reporters and the quiet hum of ceiling fans. The jury had already spoken, but the law wanted one more answer: whether Cameron Todd Willingham would live out his days in a cell or be put to death by the state of Texas. It was supposed to be about punishment, yet it became something darker, a lesson in how certainty can turn men into instruments. Prosecutor John Jackson opened by calling a psychologist. The man stepped to the stand, carrying only a folder and confidence. He wasn't board certified in psychiatry, not licensed for forensic evaluation, but he had opinions, and in that room opinions wore the costume of truth. He pointed to photographs of Todd's tattoos, a skull, a serpent, a band logo, and declared they were signs of sociopathy, symbols of demonic fascination. The jury listened as if hearing scripture. No one asked why ink on skin could prove intent. No one asked why a grieving father's music taste should decide his fate. Next came Dr. James Grigson, known across the state by a nickname whispered in courtrooms, Dr. Death. He'd testified in dozens of capital cases, always for the prosecution, always predicting future violence with absolute certainty. He claimed to read dangerousness the way others read X-rays. He never examined Todd, never spoke to him, never read his full psychiatric file. Still, when Jackson asked, "Can this man be rehabilitated?" Grigson's reply was immediate: "Absolutely not. He is an extreme sociopath who will kill again." His tone carried the finality of a verdict before the verdict. The defense objected, but the damage was irreparable. One juror later said the doctor's certainty frightened her more than the crime itself. Another said he seemed like a prophet. The irony was bitter. Years later, the American Psychiatric Association would expel Grigson for unethical conduct, diagnosing people he'd never met, promising outcomes no science could support, but that came too late for the man sitting shackled to a wooden chair. When Todd took the stand, his voice trembled. He told the court he loved his children, that the fire was an accident, that he had no reason to hurt them. He said he dreamed of them every night, saw their faces each time he closed his eyes. His lawyer asked what he wanted the jury to know. He said that "I tried." His words fell into silence. The prosecutor stood, adjusted his tie, and asked if he thought the jury should believe him. Todd's answer was soft: "I hope so." Jackson turned to the jurors, his voice suddenly thunderous. "Hope is for the innocent," he said. "Justice is for the guilty." When the sentence was read, the room seemed to shrink. Death by lethal injection. Stacy buried her face in her hands. The bailiff led Todd away, chains scraping the tile. Reporters outside began dictating updates into their microphones, the story spreading like wildfire through the wires of evening news. A father condemned, a town vindicated. In the quiet of his holding cell, Todd sat with his back against the wall, staring at the faint outline of soot still etched on his wrist where his watch had melted during the fire. The guard said he didn't cry. He just whispered something they couldn't understand. Maybe it was their names again. For years, appeals came and went. New lawyers, new experts, the same conclusion. The science of fire investigation was beginning to change, but courts moved slower than truth. By the early 2000s, independent analysts were dismantling the old methods, showing how heat alone could create the very signs once used as proof of arson. But Texas had a file stamped closed, a verdict written in ink. In the eyes of the state, it was finished. Justice had been served. The execution date waited like a shadow on the calendar. On the night before his death, a storm rolled across Huntsville. Reporters camped outside the prison gates, microphones protected by plastic, their voices swallowed by thunder. Inside, Todd wrote a letter to his parents telling them not to visit, saying he didn't want their last memory to be glass between them. He asked them to take his ashes to his daughter's graves. The next evening, he was strapped to a gurney beneath fluorescent light. Witnesses filed in, faces pale in the sterile glow. When asked for final words, he began to speak, angry, grieving. Then suddenly the warden gave a silent signal. The needle pushed clear liquid into his vein. 7 minutes later, the monitors fell silent. Outside, the rain finally stopped. They said Texas had done its duty. They said the case was closed. But in the years to come, scientists would reopen those ashes and find not guilt but error. The fire had spoken in riddles, and the people who claimed to interpret its language had mistaken chaos for intention. The man they executed had been guilty only of trusting the wrong experts. 5 years after the execution, the ashes of Cameron Todd Willingham rested beneath a small headstone in Oakwood Cemetery. His parents visited once a month, leaving 3 tiny toys shaped like angels. The world had moved on, but a few people hadn't. In Chicago, 2 investigative journalists reopened the case file, determined to read what the fire had actually said. They weren't crusaders or activists, just reporters trained to doubt every conclusion that came too quickly. What they found, buried in those transcripts, shook them both. Every principle used to prove arson had been built on myths, passed down from one generation of investigators to another, like folklore wearing a badge. The article ran in December 2004. The headline asked if Texas had executed an innocent man. Across the state, morning coffee turned cold in readers' hands. The story described how every indicator cited in court was now considered unreliable by modern standards. The burn patterns, the cracked glass, the V-shaped marks, each could appear in an accidental fire. The chemical traces used to claim accelerant could come from melted plastic or household cleaners. The certainty that once sealed a death sentence was revealed to be guesswork. The article reached the Innocence Project, where forensic scientist Dr. Gerald Hurst was already reviewing similar cases. He read it twice, then wrote a report that would haunt the Texas justice system. Hurst had spent his career studying combustion, not crime yet. His lab notes read like poetry written in equations. He described how fire moves unpredictably once oxygen saturates a closed room, how heat itself becomes the accelerant. He studied the photos from the Willingham house and saw what the original investigators had missed proof of flashover, the very phenomenon they had misread as deliberate. He concluded that the blaze behaved exactly like an accidental fire. There was no evidence of gasoline, no multiple points of ignition, only tragedy misunderstood. His words were clear, no competent investigator today would call it arson. The report traveled from Austin to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, then to the governor's desk. It was a chance for correction for the state to admit that even fire can lie. But politics rarely listens to humility. The governor brushed it aside, saying the case had been examined by many courts. "We have a good process," he told reporters. The process was all that mattered, not the result. Yet behind closed doors, even some prosecutors felt a chill. If this case was wrong, how many others rested on the same broken science? Years later, another commission, the Texas Forensic Science Commission, reviewed the evidence again. Their conclusion was devastating. The original investigators hadn't been malicious, just misinformed, guided by outdated teachings that turned natural patterns into imagined crimes. Still, the question lingered: if good intentions can kill an innocent man, what does that make the system that allowed it? The report reached national headlines, igniting debates about capital punishment and forensic reliability. Some called it redemption, others called it too late. In Corsicana, The house where the fire began had been rebuilt. Children rode bicycles past it, unaware that every brick carried a shadow. Stacy lived quietly, refusing interviews caught between memory and resentment. She once said she no longer dreamed of the fire, only of silence. For those who studied the case, silence was impossible. The story had become more than a tragedy. It was a warning carved into law enforcement manuals, a ghost whispering that science must never become faith. By the time new investigators confirmed Hearst's findings, years had passed, witnesses had died, evidence had degraded, and the state refused to reopen the conviction. The official line remained unchanged, justice served. But the evidence told another truth, a quieter one. Sometimes guilt is just the absence of doubt in people who should have doubted everything. In laboratories and classrooms across the country, young fire analysts now study this case as the moment the old beliefs burned away. Each time they look at the photographs, they learn to question, to measure twice before declaring certainty. When the rain falls over Texas now, it taps against gravestones, courthouse windows, and the roofs of homes where children sleep safe under the watch of smoke alarms. Somewhere beneath that same rain, a family still mourns 3 girls, and a state still carries the weight of a name it cannot erase. But that was only the beginning. Another file waits in the next drawer, and this time the danger will not come from flames, but from the illusion of a perfect family hiding something far colder than fire. From the outside, the Kaler home looked like something out of a postcard. 2 stories of brick and glass manicured lawn, Christmas lights trimmed with precision, the kind of house that told neighbors success lived there. Inside, Karen Kaler moved through her routines like clockwork, school lunches, folded laundry, a husband's shirt pressed just right. Her friends said she was the kind of woman who never stopped smiling, the type who made domestic life look effortless. But behind those smiles was a tension she couldn't quite name, a pressure that began the moment her husband walked through the door each night. James Craig Kaler was the kind of man people described as respectable until they knew him. A city administrator with a 6-figure salary, a man who spoke softly in meetings, yet ruled his home like a small kingdom. His neighbors admired his discipline. His co-workers feared his temper. He called it leadership. Karen called it love with conditions. To him, everything had a correct place, from the silverware drawer to the way his wife laughed in public. He measured worth in obedience. When something fell out of order, the silence that followed was worse than shouting. Karen had met Craig in college, young and hopeful. He promised her adventure, stability, and a life where she'd never have to struggle. She gave up her degree to follow him, believing she was choosing partnership. Over the years, partnership became servitude disguised as devotion. She managed the household, the schedules, the children's lessons. He managed her. When friends called, he listened from another room. When she spent too long at the grocery store, he asked for receipts. He told her he only wanted transparency. The truth was control. Their 3 children, Emily, Lauren, and Sean, adored their mother and tried to stay invisible around their father. Emily excelled in school. Lauren played sports. Sean was the youngest, his father's favorite, at least for now. To outsiders, they were the model family photos on the mantel church, on Sundays polite smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. No one saw the quiet arguments that ended with broken plates, or the way Karen's laughter had disappeared from the house entirely. She told herself things would change, that she could outlast the storms. But storms, when trapped inside walls, grow stronger. At first, Craig's demands sounded like normal marital friction. Dinner on time, shirts ironed, the children quiet during his phone calls. Over time, they became commandments. He wanted the house exactly 72 degrees. He wanted silence after 9. He wanted her in bed by 8:30, whether she was tired or not. He controlled the thermostat, the money, even her friendships. When she joined a gym for sanity, he made her quit. When she joined again in secret, she paid with small jobs, baking, cleaning, just to feel like she owned something of herself. Freedom, even a small one, is oxygen. He noticed it immediately and began to cut off her air. Friends at the gym saw the bruises first. Small at first like careless accidents, then darker, impossible to hide. She laughed them off, saying she tripped, saying she bruised easily. No one quite believed her, but few asked twice. She was good at protecting him. Abusers often count on that loyalty, the same loyalty they destroy. By the time Karen met Sunny, a trainer who listened without judgment, she was already half gone inside. Sunny saw the exhaustion behind her smile, the way she flinched at sudden sounds. They talked, then confided, then fell in love, quietly, guiltily, the way someone drowning falls toward air. Karen's world brightened for the first time in years. She had a secret that belonged to her alone, and secrets can make a person feel alive. But control doesn't surrender easily. Craig noticed the change, the lighter mood, the quiet hum of music while she cooked. He asked questions. She lied softly, thinking lies might buy her time. Instead, they built her coffin. Each denial sharpened his suspicion. Each glance at her phone became an investigation. He read her emails, her messages, her silence. Love turned to obsession, obsession to rage. By December, the foundation of that perfect home was cracked beyond repair. He accused, she defended, he punished, with cold indifference that lasted for days. The children walked on eggshells, unaware they were standing at the edge of disaster. To outsiders, nothing had changed. The holiday decorations were up, the family posed for photos, but the camera never captures the moments before a storm breaks. Beneath the golden lights, fear settled into every corner of the house. One evening, Karen sat in the darkened kitchen, fingers tracing the edge of her wedding ring. She wondered what would happen if she left. She wondered if the world would believe her. In that stillness, she heard Craig's footsteps upstairs, measured, deliberate, the sound of ownership. She whispered a single word that even she couldn't hear. It was probably goodbye. When Karen met Sunny, it didn't feel like temptation. It felt like breathing again. Sunny wasn't a secret she planned. She was a kindness that arrived when the world had gone cold. At the gym, between sets and chatter, Sunny asked about the fading bruises on Karen's arms. Karen smiled, said she'd bumped into a cabinet. Sunny didn't believe her, but didn't push. Some people offer rescue with silence, not questions. That silence became the beginning of something dangerous and necessary. They started spending time together after classes, coffee, laughter, the first real warmth Karen had felt in years. Sunny was open, calm, the opposite of Craig in every way. When she listened, it wasn't to find flaws. She listened to understand. For months, the friendship carried them quietly. Karen didn't call it love, she called it safety. But safety, once tasted, becomes addiction. By the time Craig noticed the change, it was too late. His wife had begun to exist outside his control, and to a man like him that was betrayal enough to spark war. He found a text one night, nothing scandalous, just a heart emoji, a sign-off from Sunny. For most couples it would have been a conversation. For Craig it was confirmation. He confronted her in the kitchen, his voice low, dangerous. The children were upstairs. Karen tried to stay calm, said it was innocent. He called her a liar, asked if she was sleeping with her. She said nothing, which to him was an answer. The argument cracked through the walls like thunder. The next day, neighbors said they heard shouting, then silence, then the sound of something breaking. Later, Karen told a friend she'd hidden in the bathroom for 2 hours shaking. Control disguised as forgiveness came next. Craig apologized, bought her flowers, insisted they move past it. He told her he loved her too much to lose her. He also told her she'd have to quit the gym, delete Sunny's number, and focus on her family. It sounded like compromise, but felt like captivity. Karen agreed because survival often looks like surrender. Secretly, she found ways to keep in touch: emails from a work computer, brief calls from a borrowed phone. Each message felt like a lifeline thrown across an ocean of fear. Sonny told her to leave, offered a place to stay. Karen said she couldn't. She had the kids, the house, the image to protect. Craig's obsession deepened. He began monitoring her every movement. He timed her grocery trips, called her when she was a minute late, checked the car's mileage. The family learned his moods by the sound of his footsteps. When he was calm, the air itself seemed to relax. When he wasn't, every breath felt borrowed. Emily and Lauren, the daughters, tried to defend their mother. Sean stayed quiet, confused by loyalty that hurt. Karen's parents visited one weekend and sensed the tension. They asked if she was happy. She smiled and said she was lucky. That's how abuse hides behind gratitude rehearsed to perfection. By the start of the new year, Craig's control had turned into fixation. He searched her drawers, her phone, her purse. One night while she slept, he opened her email and found a message from Sonny, a simple goodnight, nothing else. He printed it, circled the heart, and taped it to the refrigerator. When Karen saw it the next morning, her knees gave out. Craig stood behind her calm, whispering that he knew everything. He said she'd ruined the family, that she'd forced him into this. She asked what this meant, but he didn't answer. Days later came the New Year's Eve party. They attended for appearances, arriving separately but pretending to be united. Music played, laughter filled the room. Then Karen saw Sonny, unexpected, radiant, free. The moment their eyes met, Craig noticed. He froze, watching every glance, every smile between them. When Karen laughed, he clenched his fists. When Sonny touched her arm, his face went red. The host later said the tension felt like a live wire humming through the house. Before midnight, the fight began, quiet words that grew sharper, louder. Craig accused her of humiliating him in public. She shouted that she was done living afraid. Then in front of everyone, she kissed Sonny. The room fell silent. Craig's voice cracked into a growl. "You've destroyed this family," he said, then left. That kiss was more than rebellion. It was the spark that lit the fuse. Back home, Craig packed his things in silence. Karen locked the bedroom door and cried on the bathroom floor. Sonny texted her to stay safe. Karen replied, "He won't let me go." Neither of them knew how literal those words would become. The new year would not bring freedom, it would bring blood. After the New Year's party, something inside Craig Kaler snapped, though from the outside it looked like discipline tightening. He began cataloging every detail of his wife's life, the receipts, the calls, the tone of her voice when she said goodnight. He wrote down her license plate mileage each morning, before work, then again when he came home. He told friends he was documenting everything for his lawyer, but there was no case yet, only obsession wearing the mask of preparation. When Karen filed for divorce, his notes turned into scripture. Each line began with accusation, her betrayal, her sin, her corruption. Each word built a wall he would never climb over. In spring, Craig accepted a job in Columbia, Missouri, telling coworkers the move was a chance for a fresh start. In truth, it was an escape disguised as progress. He convinced Karen to follow, with the children, promising a calmer life, a reset. She agreed for the kids' sake, packing boxes with trembling hands. She told Sonny she'd keep in touch, whispering that it wasn't over, that she just needed time. Sonny warned her that distance wouldn't fix a man like Craig, it would only make him harder to escape. Karen said she understood. But love, when bound by fear, always finds a way to justify return. Missouri was colder, quieter. The neighborhood was lined with trees that shed like ghosts in October. Craig settled into his new office, telling people he'd left Texas because the culture had gone soft. He called himself a man of order in a world of chaos. At home, he imposed new rules, curfews, schedules, a strict rotation of chores. He monitored Karen's classes at the university, demanding her schedule each week. When she lingered after lectures, he waited in the parking lot, engine running, pretending coincidence. She told her classmates he was just protective. The truth was closer to surveillance. The divorce filing enraged him. He felt humiliated, stripped of the image he had crafted for years. He began to speak in fragments, rehearsing arguments that no one could win because they lived only in his mind. He blamed Sunny for everything, calling her the serpent in his garden. He left voicemail messages laced with scripture and threats, always ending with the same phrase, "You'll remember who you promised to obey." Karen saved the recordings but never called the police. Fear taught her that seeking help only made him worse. As weeks passed, his paranoia grew into ritual. He drove past her new apartment at night, lights off, watching through the windshield. He told his coworkers she was poisoning the children against him. He collected screenshots of her messages, photographs of Sunny's car, lists of dates and times no one else cared about. His colleagues stopped inviting him to lunch. They said he muttered to himself that his desk was covered in handwritten timelines. He claimed he was building a case for custody. What he was really building was justification. In November, he lost his job after an outburst during a city meeting. He returned home, furious, blaming Karen's witchcraft for his downfall. He began drinking at night, cleaning his guns in the living room, while country radio played softly in the background. Sean, their 12-year-old son, watched from the stairs. Craig smiled at him, said he was just maintaining his tools. He promised they'd go hunting soon. The boy nodded, unaware of how close his father's mind was to the edge. When Thanksgiving arrived, Karen tried to keep peace. She planned a visit to her grandmother's farm in Kansas, hoping for a normal holiday. She called Craig, offering to pick up Sean for the weekend. He agreed too easily. That night he opened the gun cabinet and laid out each rifle on the table, checking ammunition, cleaning barrels. To him, it wasn't preparation for murder, it was order restored. The world had rejected his control, so he would take it back by force. Somewhere in the background, a football game played on television, crowd cheers rising and fading like ghosts of another life. In the early morning hours of November 29th, Craig loaded the rifle into his truck. The sky was black, the road empty. He told himself he was only going to talk, only going to make her listen. But deep down he knew the conversation had ended months ago. His journals, his notes, his rage, they all led here. He drove past silent fields, past the sleeping houses that looked so much like his own, and whispered, "She can't take everything." When the first light crept over the horizon, it caught the reflection of steel resting on the passenger seat. The storm he'd been nurturing for years had finally found its weather. The morning of November 29th arrived gray and still. Frost clung to the edges of fence posts outside Burlingame, Kansas, a town so small that every porch light felt personal. Inside a warm farmhouse at the edge of the county road, Karen Kaler was setting out breakfast plates. Her daughter Emily tuned a guitar while her sister Lauren scrolled through a phone. Their grandmother Dorothy hummed softly, the scent of biscuits rising from the oven. It was the kind of ordinary morning that makes horror feel impossible. Then the sound of gravel crunching beneath tires broke the calm. Craig's pickup rolled to a stop behind the barn. He stepped out carrying the rifle case. To any passerby, it looked like a man visiting family for hunting season. But inside that case wasn't sport, it was grievance polished into steel. He walked to the back door unannounced. Sean was at the kitchen table, cleaning coins, unaware of the danger crossing the threshold. The first shot tore through the silence before anyone could stand. Karen turned, saw the weapon, and shouted her son's name. He ran. She didn't make it far. Ballistics would later show the bullet entered from close range, traveling through her chest and out the shoulder. She fell near the dining room table. Dorothy rushed forward, pleading, her voice trembling with disbelief. Craig didn't answer. He fired again. The recoil echoed through the small house, rattling dishes on shelves. Emily screamed, grabbed Lauren's hand and bolted toward the hallway. The rifle roared once more. Emily collapsed behind the couch, her body twisted as if still reaching for her sister. Lauren ran upstairs, breath shallow, heart pounding, the sound of her own feet louder than anything. She hid behind a dresser, phone in hand, whispering into the void for help. Another shot. Another scream cut short. When deputies later traced the sequence, they found Dorothy still breathing. Somehow she had crawled toward the back door, blood marking every inch. Her call for help came out as a whisper to no one. Lauren was found alive, but fading, her voice almost gone. The paramedic who reached her said she tried to speak a name, Craig. It was barely audible, just air and pain forming the word. She was 16. Within an hour, she was gone. Outside, the frost had melted into a thin mist. Neighbors heard the shots, but hesitated, believing hunters were nearby. One man walking his dog saw a truck speeding away and thought nothing of it until sirens filled the valley later that evening. When law enforcement entered the house, the warmth was gone, replaced by the smell of gunpowder and iron. Shell casings littered the floor. The rifle lay against the wall, safety off. It wasn't chaos, it was precision. Craig had reloaded twice, firing each shot deliberately. Investigators found no signs of struggle beyond the evidence of resistance: the overturned chair, the broken glass near the window, the streak of blood where Karen tried to crawl. Sean's statement would later fill in the final blanks. He said his mother had been laughing moments before it happened, showing him how to polish the old coins. He remembered the front door swinging open, his father's eyes vacant. He remembered running, hiding behind the barn, hearing every shot echo across the field. When he finally returned with a neighbor, the house looked like a war zone. He saw his mother's body first, then his sister's, then his grandmother on the floor, still clutching a rosary. He told officers that his father hadn't said a word, not even his name. Forensic teams worked through the night. The trajectory of each bullet mapped an awful order: living room, dining area, staircase, bedroom. 7 casings from a .30-06 rifle, consistent with the weapon registered to Craig. The prints matched. His truck was found abandoned along a rural road 20 miles north, the driver's seat covered with blood smears on the cuffs of a jacket. In the passenger seat sat a half-empty bottle of whiskey, 3 rounds of ammunition, and a note that read nothing more than, "I'm sorry you made me do this." When officers finally located him, walking along the roadside, hours later, he didn't resist. He looked almost relieved. He told the deputy he wanted to see his son, then asked if the other voices were quiet now. They placed him in the back of the patrol car and drove through the same dawn he had once shared with the family he'd destroyed. The rifle, tagged as evidence number 31, would later rest behind glass in the courthouse basement, a piece of metal that carried a family's entire ending. In the courtroom photographs taken that day, Sean sits between 2 deputies, eyes blank, hands folded. A child who lived because fate decided to spare him. He would testify steady and brave, but the echo of that morning would never leave him. The man once called father would sit only feet away, expressionless, as if watching someone else's trial. The trial began 2 years later in a packed Kansas courtroom where the smell of wood polish couldn't mask the tension. Reporters filled the first 3 rows, waiting for the boy who had survived to walk in. Sean Kaler, now 12, entered quietly, his small frame swallowed by a suit 1 size too large. The jury watched him with the reverence reserved for miracles and tragedies. The prosecutor introduced him as the only living witness to the massacre. Sean didn't look at his father when he took the stand. He looked at the floor, as if eye contact might summon ghosts. His voice was soft but steady. He described sitting at the table, cleaning coins with his mother, the sudden crack of a gun, and the world breaking apart. He said he ran. He said he heard his sisters scream, heard his grandmother calling for help. When asked who fired the gun, he spoke the name without hesitation: Craig. The courtroom fell silent. The defense attorney glanced at his client, searching for reaction. There was none. Craig sat still, his jaw tight, eyes forward, a man carved from denial. The defense argued insanity. They brought psychologists who described years of depression, control issues, and possible dissociative episodes. They said he was broken, that he didn't understand what he'd done. The prosecutor countered with precision, premeditation, weapon cleaning, ammunition purchased, deliberate targeting. He knew exactly what he was doing, she said. He just thought he had the right. The photographs projected behind her said everything her words didn't, each image a frozen scream, each detail another nail in the coffin of mercy. Sunny, the woman who had loved Karen, took the stand next. Her hands shook as she described the years of fear, the controlling calls, the threats, the bruises Karen had tried to hide. She said Karen was planning to leave for good, that she'd packed a small bag that Craig knew. The courtroom listened in silence, the sound of pens scratching paper louder than breath. When asked why Karen stayed so long, Sunny said something that made several jurors wipe their eyes. Because he made her believe she couldn't survive without him. The forensic evidence left no space for doubt. Ballistic trajectories matched the rifle found in Craig's truck. Gunshot residue covered his hands and sleeves. His fingerprints were on the ammunition box. His journal, recovered from a drawer at his parents' home, contained pages of rants about betrayal and purity. One line read, "If I can't fix what's broken, I'll erase it." The defense tried to spin it as metaphor, but the words felt like prophecy. When Craig took the stand, he called the killings an act of emotional overload, claiming he'd been driven by voices. The prosecutor asked if those voices had loaded the gun for him. He didn't answer. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours. They returned with the verdict everyone expected: guilty of capital murder. The judge's voice trembled slightly as he read the sentence, death. Craig's expression didn't change. He asked to be excused from hearing the victim impact statements. The judge refused. One by one, family members stood. Sean, now trembling but resolute, read from a small card. "I loved Grandma, Mom, Emily, and Lauren. I will miss them until the end of my days." His voice broke, but he finished. "I don't want my dad to die. I just don't want my whole family gone." Even hardened officers turned away. The boy's forgiveness, fragile and undeserved, hung in the air like a mercy no one could accept. Craig looked down for the first time, and a single tear slid down his cheek. Whether it was regret or self-pity, no one knew. The bailiffs led him away as Sean was ushered from the stand, his small shoulders heavy with an inheritance no child should carry. Years later, Sean would graduate high school, quietly avoiding reporters who still wanted to call him the boy who survived. He worked in Kansas, lived simply, and rarely spoke about that day. He told one interviewer that forgiveness wasn't about absolution, it was about survival. "If I stayed angry," he said, "he'd still own me." The interviewer asked if he believed his father loved him. Sean paused for a long time, then said, "Maybe in his way, but that way killed everyone else." The Kaylor case became another file in the shelves of American violence, domestic, deliberate, tragic. But before the dust settled across an ocean, another family's nightmare was beginning. This time the monster wasn't a husband or a father. It was a system convinced of guilt, built on impossible timing and science no one fully understood. Before dawn on August 30th, 2000, the small city of Palmerston, North New Zealand, stirred awake under gray light. A neighbor named Glenn Wedger knocked on the door of his sister's house, expecting coffee and small talk. No one answered. The door was ajar. He stepped inside, calling her name. The smell hit him first, copper, damp and final. In the master bedroom, he found his sister Christine lying across the bed, the sheets soaked dark. Near the doorway, his niece Amber, 7 years old, still in her nightgown, lay face down on the carpet. The silence in the room was so complete that it took Glenn a moment to realize he was screaming. Within an hour, police sealed the house with yellow tape. The television was still on. The family computer had been shut down neatly the night before, not unplugged, not crashed. The investigators read that detail like handwriting from a ghost. Christine's body showed massive blunt force trauma, the kind of violence that speaks of rage more than robbery. Amber's small frame bore the same pattern, each blow deliberate, each one personal. Nothing of real value was missing: wallets, jewelry, electronics, untouched. A small trinket box gone from the dresser was the only item unaccounted for. Burglary didn't fit. Whoever had done this knew them. The husband, Mark Lundy, was away that night in Lower Hutt, nearly 150 kilometers south, on a business trip selling kitchen fittings. At 5:30 in the evening, he had spoken to Christine by phone. She and Amber were picking up dinner at McDonald's. The receipt on the counter matched her story. She was alive at 5:45. By 7, a friend called and said Christine had sounded normal, cheerful even. Sometime after that, everything turned. Investigators would later find the family computer shut down precisely at 10:52 p.m., the last recorded action before the murders. Someone had pressed the power key and waited for the screen to go black. When police reached Mark by phone the next morning, he was stunned and silent. He told them he had been in his motel room all night, that he'd even called an escort service around 11:30. The call record was there, the visit verified. The alibi seemed airtight, too airtight for the brutality waiting back home. Yet, suspicion has gravity. It pulls toward the person closest to the dead. When detectives searched his car, they found a neatly folded polo shirt tucked inside a zipped tool bag. On its front were small brown stains no one could identify. They sent it to the lab just in case. News of the murders spread through New Zealand like wildfire. Cameras lined the street, reporters whispering that a father might have slaughtered his family for insurance money. They pointed to the couple's debts, to a recent attempt to expand their business, to a life insurance policy signed only days before the killings. To the public, motive was simple: arithmetic, money, and despair. To the police, it was enough to justify a deeper look. Forensic teams combed the house, searching for forced entry, but every lock was intact. There was no broken glass, no pry marks, no signs of a struggle beyond the destruction inside the bedroom. They reconstructed the night minute by minute. The restaurant receipt, the phone calls, the computer shut-off, all of it mapped into a narrow window of possibility. If Mark was guilty, he would have had to drive the 3-hour route from Lower Hutt to Palmerston North, kill his wife and daughter, clean himself, and drive back before sunrise. The timeline felt impossible, but impossibility has never stopped prosecution when the story fits too neatly. Christine's family defended Mark at first. They said he adored Amber, that he couldn't even watch a child cry without tearing up. But as the media narrative grew darker, public sympathy shifted. The image of a grieving husband sobbing at the funeral became the centerpiece of every nightly broadcast. His collapse beside the casket was replayed so often that grief itself began to look performative. Was he mourning or acting? In the court of public opinion, those two things became the same. Investigators began to see guilt in every gesture. They noted his expensive car, his failed investments, his shaky finances. They saw a man drowning in debt who might view death as a transaction. But between the arithmetic of motive and the physics of time, something didn't add up. The road between the two cities was long, the timeline razor thin. Still, in the corners of the lab, technicians studied the stained shirt and whispered that it could hold the answer to everything. That whisper would soon turn into a theory, and the theory would become an accusation that stretched the limits of science. What no one realized then was that this case would not only decide one man's fate, it would expose how far the justice system would go to make certainty out of shadows. The funeral of Christine and Amber Lundy was held on a cold September morning. The sky hung low and colorless, a mirror to the mood inside the small church. Nearly the entire town came to watch a father bury his family, but grief had already become evidence. Mark Lundy arrived between two relatives, trembling, barely able to walk. Cameras followed every movement as if the truth might reveal itself in the way his knees buckled. When he reached the front pew and saw the small white coffin beside the larger one, something in him collapsed. He wailed, his voice cracking, his body shaking so violently that ushers rushed to hold him upright. To some it was human, to others it was theater. In that single moment, grief turned to suspicion. Television crews replayed the footage for days. The public began calling him the crying man, and psychologists on talk shows dissected every frame. One anchor said he looked like a performer caught in his own play. Another called it guilt leaking through emotion. No one asked how grief is supposed to look when your world has been erased. By the end of that week, even the detectives investigating the murders had started to interpret his breakdown through the lens of performance. The power of the image had already done its damage. To many, he was no longer a husband in mourning. He was an actor hiding in plain sight. Behind the scenes, the investigation began to tighten. Detectives compared his travel times with traffic cameras and fuel receipts. They found no proof he'd left his motel that night, but the absence of proof became an argument in itself. They said he was cunning, that he planned carefully. The escort's testimony placed him in his room around midnight, yet prosecutors would later argue that even that could have been staged. The case was turning into a puzzle that demanded guilt at its center. Once the story caught momentum, no one wanted to consider another ending. Forensic teams focused on the shirt found in Lundy's car. Under ultraviolet light, faint smears glowed across the fabric. Analysts couldn't say what the substance was, only that it reacted strangely. A sample was sent overseas to a laboratory in Texas. The report that came back would change the case forever. It claimed the stains contained central nervous system tissue, human brain matter. The suggestion was chilling. According to the Crown, the tissue belonged to Christine. It was a detail that didn't just imply guilt, it screamed it. Reporters announced the discovery before the defense even saw the paperwork. Headlines declared that a husband had worn his wife's brain on his shirt. The science was untested, but the shock was irresistible. Television networks aired reenactments of the supposed murder timeline. Experts who had never seen the evidence spoke confidently about trajectories and DNA. The country wanted a monster, and the image of a grieving man turned killer filled the void perfectly. When detectives rewatched the funeral footage, they no longer saw sorrow, they saw a man performing contrition. Each tear became strategy, each stumble manipulation. They noted how he wailed when cameras were near and fell silent when they turned away. In their reports, emotion was cataloged like evidence. The narrative was complete debt, greed, murder, and guilt disguised as grief. The court of public opinion had convicted him long before the trial began. But a few observers saw something else. A local pastor said Mark's breakdown reminded him of shock so deep it rewired the body. He wasn't crying for sympathy, the pastor told a journalist. He was crying because he didn't know what else to do. His words never made the front page. Grief without villainy wasn't news. Meanwhile, Christine's brother Glenn struggled with guilt of his own. He had found the bodies, spoken first to police, given interviews that repeated in his nightmares. He told reporters he wanted justice, not vengeance, but even he wasn't sure anymore what either word meant. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his sister's face frozen in that last moment. Every time he turned on the television, he saw her husband's face under the headline, "Killer." As months passed, the case transformed from tragedy into obsession. Talk radio hosts debated whether science could lie. Bar conversations in Wellington and Auckland ended with someone whispering that grief that loud could only mean guilt. The footage from the funeral kept airing stripped of context, a loop of a man breaking down for the world's entertainment. The line between truth and theater blurred until even investigators couldn't tell the difference. Somewhere inside that blur, justice began to bend toward whatever story fit the crowd's expectation. And in that distortion, the seeds of one of New Zealand's most controversial convictions took root. In the sterile quiet of a laboratory thousands of miles from New Zealand, a single stained shirt sat sealed in plastic. Under fluorescent light, the fabric looked ordinary, pale blue cotton, a few faint brown specks near the chest pocket, but to prosecutors, it had become the key to everything. The sample was sent to a forensic facility in Texas that specialized in what they called molecular identification. The technology sounded impressive. In truth, it was experimental, an mRNA analysis technique never before used in a criminal trial. Its purpose was to identify tissue type, not people. The scientists believed they could tell whether a stain came from muscle, skin, or brain. Belief, however, is not validation. When the results arrived, the report read with chilling certainty, central nervous system tissue consistent with human origin. The prosecution announced that Christine Lundy's brain matter had been found on her husband's shirt. The claim rocketed through the media like an explosion. Headlines spoke of monstrous evidence of a man so careless that he carried pieces of his victim on his clothes. The public didn't ask how such a finding could even be verified. The image alone was enough. Guilt no longer needed context. It had a headline and a photograph. Defense attorneys were blindsided. They demanded to see the data, but the testing lab refused, citing proprietary methodology. The expert flown in to testify presented diagrams and color charts that looked like science, spoke in phrases that sounded technical, and told the jury that the likelihood of error was negligible. He didn't mention that no peer-reviewed publication existed, or that the process had never been replicated outside that room. What began as one lab's theory became the cornerstone of a murder conviction. In the theater of justice, spectacle often outweighs scrutiny. Back in New Zealand, forensic pathologists quietly questioned the claim. Brain tissue is fragile, they said. It decomposes quickly, especially on fabric left in a car trunk for days. Even if it had once been there, contamination or degradation would make reliable identification impossible. Some suspected the stain was food residue, oil, or environmental debris. But in court, doubt sounded like desperation. The Crown's expert spoke with calm authority, using the same certainty once wielded by arson investigators in Texas, years earlier, a poetic irony lost on everyone except a few weary scientists watching from afar. During cross-examination, the defense tried to expose cracks. They asked how the sample had been stored, who handled it, whether controls were used. The experts' answers were long, technical, and evasive. Jurors shifted in their seats, struggling to follow. Complexity breeds compliance. When the language becomes too dense, people choose trust over understanding. The prosecutor capitalized on that fog, repeating one clear phrase. Her brain was on his shirt. It was a sentence that required no expertise to believe, and no evidence to haunt. Meanwhile, other parts of the puzzle failed to fit. There was no blood spatter linking Mark to the scene, no fingerprints, no witness who saw him leave his motel. The travel timeline required superhuman speed, covering hundreds of kilometers in hours that barely existed. But science, or what passed for it, silenced the questions. To challenge the data sounded like denying gravity. The jury was told that molecules don't lie. They weren't told that people interpreting them often do. Outside the courthouse, reporters repeated the soundbite until it became mantra. Brain tissue found. Scientific breakthrough. Case closed. Laboratories became oracles and jurors their congregation. In whispered conversations, a few forensic specialists wondered if the system had learned nothing from past mistakes. If the same blind faith that once condemned a man for misunderstood fire patterns was repeating itself under fluorescent light and microscopes. But skepticism rarely makes headlines. Certainty does. When the verdict finally came, it rested on that shirt. Every narrative of motive, opportunity, and impossible travel was anchored to those microscopic stains. The prosecution's closing line echoed across the courtroom. Only one explanation fits all the facts. It was wrong, but it was simple, and simplicity wins. The jury took it as gospel. By the time Mark Lundy's lawyers filed the appeal, the stain on that shirt had become the most famous patch of fabric in New Zealand. To the public, it was proof unshakable. To the defense, it was a mirage built from science no one could verify. The first conviction had been secured in 2002, and Mark was serving life in prison when a new team of attorneys took up his case. They were not interested in sympathy. They wanted to know why the laboratory that tested the shirt refused to release raw data. What they found was chaos disguised as order. Chain of custody forms unsigned, storage temperatures unrecorded. Methodology documented in vague language that might as well have been poetry. It was, one expert said, like building a conviction on a dream written in a lab notebook. The defense petitioned for independent testing. When other scientists examined the stain using verified procedures, they couldn't replicate the result. Some found no identifiable tissue at all. Others found degradation so severe that any conclusion was meaningless. The supposed brain matter had turned into dust and doubt. The lawyers argued that the prosecution's star evidence violated every principle of scientific reliability. The appeals court listened, then hesitated. Overturning a conviction means admitting error, and institutions rarely volunteer confession. It took over a decade, new technology, and persistent outrage before the case was reopened. The retrial in 2015 felt like déjà vu played in higher definition. The courtroom was larger, the cameras sharper, but the story was the same: a husband, a wife, a child, and a shirt. Prosecutors now changed the timeline. They claimed Mark had driven the 3-hour route between the two cities in the dead of night, right after contacting an escort. According to this theory, he somehow completed the round trip over 300 kilometers within a window of just a few hours, committed a double murder, cleaned himself and his car, and returned unnoticed. When the defense pointed out that the journey was physically impossible without speeding through every red light, the Crown responded that criminals defy logic. It wasn't a legal argument, it was faith. Expert witnesses from the original trial returned, some older, some weary. They softened their language, saying the tissue was consistent with rather than identical to human brain matter. The nuance was lost on the jury. In closing statements, prosecutors repeated the old phrase, trusting memory to blur the distinction. Meanwhile, defense experts meticulously dismantled the forensic narrative. They demonstrated how cross-contamination reagent errors or even lab cloth fibers could mimic biological material under certain chemical stains. They cited international standards that would have barred the original test from evidence entirely. Science, they said, is not a weapon, it is a question. The jury listened, but belief had already set like concrete. When verdict day came, Mark stood as he had 15 years earlier, hands clasped, eyes tired. The jurors filed in expressions blank. Guilty, the foreman said. The sound echoed as if history had looped. Outside reporters rushed to broadcast the headline again, unaware that the new conviction rested on the same fragile foundation. Later, the appellate judges would describe the evidence as troubling but admissible. It was a phrase that managed to be both cautious and cowardly. By 2018, the Court of Appeal reviewed the case once more. This time, they questioned not only the science but the influence of media. They noted that jurors had likely seen footage of the funeral replayed endlessly during the trial. They acknowledged that emotional contamination could bias perception as easily as chemical contamination taints a sample. The conviction was declared unsafe, and a third trial was threatened but never pursued. After nearly 2 decades, Mark Lundy walked free, a man aged by years lost to an era that wore a lab coat. Outside, the courthouse rain streaked the camera lenses. Mark didn't celebrate. He simply said, "It's over, but it's never really over." Reporters asked if he felt vindicated. He said no, because vindication doesn't bring back his wife and daughter, and it doesn't erase the years branded as murderer. What it does, he said, is prove how easily science can be turned into story when truth becomes inconvenient. That night, as the headlines faded and the country moved on, a new horror was already waiting in another city, another family home. It would begin not with questionable evidence, but with a boy and a screen, and a fascination so dark that it made even murder look rehearsed. By the time the sun rose over Luton on September 13, 2024, 3 lives had already been erased inside a modest flat on Wells Bank Drive. The neighbors woke to the sound of sirens, unaware that a teenager they'd known for years had transformed the night before into something unrecognizable. His name was Nicholas Prosper, 19 years old, quiet, polite, and invisible until he wasn't. His mother, Juliana, and his younger siblings, Giselle and Kyle, were dead before dawn. What the public would learn later was that the killings were not impulsive. They were a rehearsal for something larger, something planned with chilling patience. Nicholas had been born in December 2005, the youngest of four, diagnosed early with autism spectrum disorder. Teachers described him as intelligent but detached, a boy who preferred the company of screens to people. His mother called him gentle. She worked long hours to give him stability after his parents separated, keeping their small home warm with the kind of love that expects nothing back. But Nicholas had retreated deep into an online world where empathy was weakness and violence was performance. He watched videos of shootings, studied timelines, collected manifestos like souvenirs. The more he read, the more the line between reality and fantasy blurred. By the summer of 2024, his search history had turned into a confession written in code. He looked up firearm licensing laws, studied the architecture of his old primary school, and researched ammunition calibers. When he couldn't acquire a gun legally, he forged documents using templates found in dark corners of the internet. The deception worked. In late August, he purchased a double-barreled shotgun and 100 cartridges from a local dealer who never guessed the license was fake. Police were notified about the odd paperwork, but by the time the report moved through channels, it was too late. The weapon was already in Nicholas's bedroom, hidden under a blanket beside his laptop. On the night of September 12th, he filmed a video message. In it, he spoke calmly about a plan he called his final project. He wore black and yellow clothes. The colors, he said, represented his allegiance to a fictional character from a game he'd twisted into a personal mythology. He said he intended to kill his family first, then attack his former school during morning assembly. His voice held no anger, no passion, just the eerie steadiness of a person who had reduced life to logic. When he finished, he uploaded the video to a private forum and shut his laptop. The rain outside had started soft and steady. At 4:30 in the morning, he loaded the shotgun and stepped into the hallway. His mother woke first. She saw the weapon, screamed his name, and lunged. He stabbed her with a kitchen knife, then fired once. The blast echoed down the narrow corridor. His sister Giselle ran from her room, the second shot grazing her head. She tried to hide under the table, crying his name. He fired again. Kyle, 16, tried to tackle him, grabbing the knife. Nicholas shot him in the chest, then stabbed him repeatedly until the blade bent. When police later counted the cartridges, they found 7 spent shells. The attack lasted less than a minute. Neighbors reported thuds shouting, then silence. One woman said she heard a young voice moaning before another shot rang out. By the time the first emergency call came in, Nicholas was already gone, walking calmly toward the park with the shotgun in a bag. He left the flat, unlocked his victims where they fell. CCTV later showed him pacing near St. Joseph's Catholic Primary School, his chosen target. The building was closed. Patrol cars began to fill the area. At 7:55, he stepped from the trees and waved down an officer. His face and hands were covered in blood. He said, "It's not murder," then again louder, "It's not murder." At the station, he was disturbingly cheerful. He asked if the schools were locked down. He made small talk about video games. During interrogation, he described planning the attack for a year, inspired by other shooters he idolized online. He spoke about children as objectives, using the word the way gamers use points. Detectives wrote in their report that he displayed no sign of remorse, no fear, no confusion, only pride. When psychologists later examined him, they found traits of autism, but emphasized that diagnosis was not cause. What had driven him was ideology, obsession, and isolation, sharpened by the algorithm of violence. The murders shocked Britain, not only for their brutality, but for how close he had come to turning them into a mass shooting. Juliana's colleagues described her as kind, overworked, endlessly patient. She had asked social services for help years earlier, worried about Nicholas's behavior, but the waiting list was long. By the time anyone responded, the warning signs had become a manifesto. In the end, it wasn't illness alone that failed them. It was a system too slow to recognize that monsters aren't born overnight. They are built click by click, until one morning they walk into daylight and start shooting. The trial of Nicholas Prosper began in March of 2025 under fluorescent lights that never dimmed. Reporters filled the gallery, faces pale, pens ready, as though words could contain what he had done. The courtroom smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. On the defense bench, Nicholas sat perfectly still, his posture unnervingly calm. He refused to look at photographs of the victims. He declined to meet the eyes of the families watching him. When the judge asked if he understood the charges, he smiled faintly and said, "They were already gone before I did it." The clerk dropped his pen. Silence followed like gravity. Investigators had spent months unraveling his digital trail. It led through forums, gaming servers, and encrypted message boards where violence was treated like art. They found drafts of his manifesto spreadsheets, listing potential targets, even weather forecasts he had downloaded to plan the best time for maximum coverage. In one folder labeled Endgame were screenshots of the school layout, annotated with arrows and casualty projections. He'd studied other shooters, scoring them like competition. The precision was terrifying, the detachment worse. Detectives called it the most chilling planning they had ever seen from someone his age. The prosecution described a murder driven by delusion and ego. They argued that Nicholas saw himself as director and executioner in his own fantasy film. He had written that killing was a way to become permanent. His attorney countered that he was mentally unwell, a boy drowning in untreated autism and psychosis, unable to distinguish imagination from reality. Psychiatric evaluations disagreed. Nicholas could tell right from wrong. He just didn't care. The court found competence. He would stand trial as an adult. Police testimony detailed the timeline of failure that had allowed him to act. Months earlier, a firearms licensing department had flagged irregularities in his paperwork, but a clerical backlog delayed the inspection. Had they visited his home, they would have found the shotgun in the plan. Social services had closed his file due to lack of follow-up. The head of the division later resigned, citing exhaustion. It was an ecosystem of cracks, and Nicholas had slipped through every one of them. In the courtroom, the jury listened to experts dissect motive like anatomy. Psychiatrists spoke of moral disengagement of identity, collapse of how isolation magnifies fantasy until empathy dies. One explained how Nicholas built an alternate universe online, feeding on attention. He saw violence as communication, she said. It was the only language he thought anyone would understand. When asked if he felt remorse, he told her no. "Remorse is for people who fail," he said. "I finished what I started." Her voice trembled, repeating it. During the proceedings, the video he filmed before the murders was played. The room darkened and his face filled the screen, calm, expressionless, speaking with chilling precision about cleansing weakness from the world. He looked into the camera and said, "This is not revenge. It's design." Several jurors cried. The judge ordered a break. Outside reporters broadcast the footage's description to millions. Within hours, online commentators began debating whether he was monster or symptom, madman or mirror. The line separating those labels blurred with every broadcast. The verdict came swiftly: guilty on all counts of murder and attempted terrorism. The judge called the crimes a calculated slaughter of innocents. Nicholas stared ahead, blinking once as if bored. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 40 years. When the sentence was read, a sigh rippled through the courtroom. Not relief, not justice, but exhaustion. There were no cheers, only silence that felt heavier than grief. After the trial, police released their full report. It painted a portrait of systemic failure, a background of ignored warnings, understaffed mental health units, and the digital breeding ground that had replaced friendship. The report concluded with one line: he was invisible until it was too late. Juliana's relatives demanded reform. They wanted stricter monitoring of online extremism, faster firearm checks, more mental health funding. Parliament held a brief debate, promising review, then moved on to other business. The world forgets faster than it heals. Months later, a memorial garden was built behind St. Joseph's School. The children planted white roses in honor of the victims and the lives that might have been lost had Nicholas reached the gates. On rainy mornings, teachers still hear students whisper his name in fear, proof that evil once shown never fully disappears. Somewhere in a gray cell, Nicholas spends his days reading history books and sketching diagrams of things no one will ever see again. He calls them corrections. For the rest of the country, it is simply a reminder that prevention is not compassion's opposite, it is its only proof. In the summer of 1996, Chicago shimmered under heat thick enough to bend light. The Thompson family vanished during that heat wave, a disappearance so complete that police at first thought they'd moved without notice. Lydia and Everett Thompson, both 40, were quiet people, steady, responsible, raising their two children, Rachel and Benjamin, in a narrow red brick home on South Prairie Avenue. Lydia worked as a nurse at a nearby hospital, Everett at a construction supply yard. They weren't rich, but they were solid, the kind of family whose absence should have been impossible to miss. And yet one July morning, their mail began to pile up. A week later, their neighbor noticed the smell. When officers entered the house, they found no bodies, no signs of struggle, no forced entry. The refrigerator hummed. The beds were neatly made. On the kitchen table sat a half-written grocery list, a pen uncapped beside it. It looked like they had stepped outside mid-sentence. The air was heavy with something metallic and wrong, but every room was spotless. Then in the basement, investigators found bleach bottles lined up on the concrete floor, still damp. The drain cover was missing. What they could not find was the family that had lived there. It was the kind of case that erases certainty. Without remains, even the word murder becomes hesitant. Detective Marcus Leland led the search. He'd handled homicides, but this was different. You can't chase ghosts, he told the press, but you can follow what they leave behind. The Thompsons' vehicles were both in the driveway. Their wallets, purses, and identifications sat untouched. Their bank accounts stopped moving after July 3rd. Neighbors last saw Lydia hanging laundry that afternoon. A friend claimed to have spoken with Everett by phone the same night, though later the call record suggested it came from the house line long after he should have been gone. Forensic techs combed the basement, lifting samples from every surface. Under blacklight, faint streaks appeared across the concrete, cleaned but not erased. The samples tested positive for biological evidence enough to indicate that at least one person had been gravely injured in that room. The pattern didn't fit an accident. The spatter was low, circular, like impact wounds near the floor. The forensic team couldn't identify whose it was. DNA testing was still in its infancy, and contamination was likely. Still, the pattern told a story, one of violence, followed by careful cleaning. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. They hadn't panicked. They'd worked methodically, scrubbing, until their reflection returned on wet cement. Detectives interviewed relatives. Lydia's sister said she'd been worried for months. Everett's brother, Kenneth White, seemed strangely detached. He said they'd gone on a trip, that Lydia needed a break from everything. When asked where, he shrugged. Officers noted his calm, the way he spoke of them in past tense, then corrected himself. His alibi for that weekend was thin, working on a property renovation out in Chatham, he said. No witnesses, no receipts. Still, with no bodies, there was no charge. Chicago police listed the Thompsons as missing persons. Their photos circulated on television for weeks, a smiling family against a background of picnic grass, faces so ordinary they hurt to look at. Months turned into years. Tips trickled in, sightings in Michigan and Missouri, all false. The case file thickened while the evidence thinned. Lydia's parents died before ever learning what happened to their daughter. The house changed owners 3 times, each reporting unease in the basement, though no one could say why. Detective Leland kept the file on his desk long after it stopped being active. He once told a rookie that the hardest part of police work wasn't seeing death. It was not seeing it and knowing it was still there. Then in late 1997, a man renovating his bathroom in the same neighborhood tore up old tile and found what looked like a bloodstain beneath the subfloor. Tests confirmed human origin. It didn't belong to anyone listed missing from that property. When investigators cross-referenced the batch numbers of the flooring adhesive, it matched materials bought by Kenneth White's company the summer the Thompsons disappeared. A new name surfaced, one that would soon turn a missing persons file into a homicide case without bodies. But before they could act, the suspect vanished too. The Thompson case became legend in local law enforcement, a story told to rookies about silence heavier than any crime scene. Without remains, justice couldn't begin. Yet every detective who stood in that basement swore they could still feel presence, like air remembering screams it couldn't release. Kenneth White had always been the quiet one. While Everett Thompson built a steady life, Kenneth drifted small jobs, quick money, and a knack for bending truth without breaking it. When his brother's family vanished, he seemed unfazed. He told reporters he wasn't surprised that Everett and Lydia had talked about starting over. He smiled when he said it, a small twitch that didn't reach his eyes. Police noted the lack of grief but had nothing tangible. Without remains, suspicion was smoke. Still, detectives watched him. Every lie leaves residue, and Kenneth's began to glisten under pressure. In late 1997, he began selling off properties around the South Side, including one registered in Everett's name. The signature on the deed looked convincing, too convincing. Handwriting analysts later said it was a near-perfect forgery, traced and reheated with pressure. When county records flagged the inconsistency, Kenneth produced a notarized letter claiming power of attorney. The notary's signature turned out to belong to a man who died 3 years earlier. Yet the transaction went through before the forgery was caught. By the time the ink dried, Kenneth had pocketed thousands. Investigators called it fraud. Quietly, they called it confession in disguise. Detective Marcus Leland revisited Kenneth's property on West 92nd Street that winter. Snow had begun to fall, muffling the world into stillness. The small bungalow smelled of paint and chemicals. Kenneth said he was remodeling, that the floors had been damaged by leaks. The bathroom tiles were new, the grout still damp. But when Leland stepped onto the linoleum, he heard the hollow echo of something covered, not fixed. He asked if he could check the crawl space. Kenneth laughed, said sure, and handed him a flashlight. The beam revealed freshly sawed boards stacked neatly near the wall, the ground beneath uneven. Leland crouched, scraped the dirt, and saw red staining the wood's underside. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old enough to forget. Forensics later confirmed traces of human hemoglobin, though degraded beyond identification. It was the same chemical profile as the sample from the Thompson basement. The odds of coincidence were microscopic. Still, without a body, prosecutors hesitated. They needed more than blood, they needed narrative. Leland built it, piece by piece, the missing drain cover, the bleach bottles, the forged signature, the remodeled floor. He believed Kenneth had killed the entire family, dismembered the remains in the basement, then buried or disposed of them during renovation work across the city. Each job site became a potential grave. When questioned again, Kenneth's composure cracked. He denied everything, then shifted stories, first claiming Everett had fallen into debt with dangerous people, then suggesting Lydia ran off with someone else. Each version contradicted the last. His timeline of July 4th changed by hours each time he spoke. Police obtained a warrant, tearing up sections of his property. Beneath the concrete slab of the garage, they found fragments of clothing fiber fused with adhesive. later matched microscopically to the same manufacturer as Lydia's hospital uniform. It wasn't proof, but it was close enough to make detectives sick. In January 1998, Kenneth attempted to sell another property, a duplex on Chatham Avenue, where workers discovered the bathroom walls recently painted over in streaks of reddish-brown. The painter, uneasy, called police. Leland arrived first. He noticed the odor before the door even opened, metallic sour, the faint scent of old decay masked by bleach. In the kitchen, portions of the linoleum had been replaced with plywood. Under one loose board, they found a single human tooth, later identified through dental X-ray as belonging to Lydia Thompson. It was the first physical proof of murder. The press erupted. The story hit every front page across Illinois. Missing family no longer missing evidence in brother's home. Kenneth was arrested the next morning, but released within 48 hours, pending further evidence. Without complete remains, the state couldn't secure a conviction. 2 weeks later, he disappeared. His truck was found abandoned near a quarry outside Joliet. Inside was a note scrawled on an envelope. "They're all together now." The handwriting matched his own. A week later, hikers found his body in the woods nearby, a self-inflicted gunshot wound and a small bottle of whiskey beside him. He left no confession, only the silence of a man who knew the truth would never face trial. When investigators reopened the Thompson case in 2003, DNA advances confirmed the basement evidence matched Lydia's bloodline. The family had indeed died there. Their bodies were never recovered. The file was marked closed but never solved because no court heard the story and no verdict could name guilt beyond death. For Detective Leland, it was justice wrapped in absence. For the city, it was one more whisper in the long haul of unfinished endings. When federal agents joined the Thompson investigation in late 1998, the case had already drifted toward legend. Kenneth White was dead, the suspected killer buried under the same gray Illinois soil that likely hid his family. Yet protocol demanded closure. The FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force reopened the files, reviewing hundreds of pages of transcripts, photographs, and forensic samples collected years earlier. They were looking for certainty, but certainty had decayed along with everything else. The basement on South Prairie Avenue had long since been remodeled, painted bright yellow by new owners who didn't know what lived beneath the floor. Still, when agents stepped inside, one said he could smell bleach even decades later. Boxes of evidence sat stacked in a government warehouse, slides, fibers, and fragments labeled in fading ink. New DNA analysis techniques allowed agents to re-examine them. In a sterile lab in Quantico, technicians unsealed vials that hadn't been opened since 1997. Inside one tube, they found degraded but viable genetic material. It matched Lydia's parents, confirming what everyone already knew, but never proved at least one of the remains belonged to her. Another trace, though, didn't match anyone in the family. It belonged to an unidentified male, neither Everett nor Kenneth. The discovery complicated everything. Had Kenneth acted alone, or had someone helped him hide the evidence? The file swelled with new questions, but no new answers. Agents interviewed surviving relatives, most of them old now. Lydia's mother had passed away the previous winter, leaving behind a box of her daughter's letters tied in ribbon. Her father, frail and nearly blind, told them he didn't want truth anymore, just peace. "If God's already judged him," he said, "what's left for us to find?" His words haunted the younger investigators, men and women trained to believe every mystery has a resolution. In this case, the truth lay somewhere between dirt and memory, unreachable by subpoenas or science. The FBI traced Kenneth's movements in the months before his suicide. He'd taken contracts across Illinois and Indiana, pouring concrete foundations for homes and small businesses. Each job site was examined. Ground-penetrating radar revealed nothing definitive, just the occasional anomaly dismissed as rubble. One location near Joliet showed a cavity under a slab, but excavation found only construction waste pipes, insulation, broken wood. Detectives eventually concluded that Kenneth had disposed of the remains piecemeal, scattering them across multiple sites, leaving no single grave to discover. The act wasn't madness, it was precision. He had erased a family not only from life but from geography. The discovery of the unidentified DNA kept the file technically open. Some agents speculated Kenneth had helped perhaps a laborer from one of his jobs who didn't realize what they were moving. Others suspected contamination and investigators' own DNA mixed in before protocols improved. There was no way to know. Every possible explanation carried its own ache. The case was quietly transferred to inactive status in 2002, then archived. No press release, no ceremony. Just a memo that read, "No further investigative avenues." Detective Marcus Leland retired that same year. On his last day, he carried the Thompson file to his desk and read it one final time. He said the hardest part wasn't that they'd never found the bodies, but that the story had lost witnesses faster than it gained facts. Memory fades, evidence doesn't, but evidence without memory becomes meaningless. He placed the file back in the cabinet, locked it, and left the badge on top. That night, rain fell steady over Chicago, washing dust from sidewalks that had once carried the missing family's footsteps. In the years that followed, the case appeared in true crime books and late-night documentaries. Each version told it differently. Some called Kenneth a sociopath, others a tragic brother undone by envy. A few tried to resurrect theories of strangers or cults, but none held weight. The truth remained exactly where it had always been, somewhere between what the evidence could prove and what the heart refused to accept. At the edge of the city cemetery, a small plaque bears the Thompson name without dates. Visitors leave flowers there, sometimes even though no one rests beneath. The wind moves through the grass, the same sound that might once have filled the basement before the bleach and silence. Every detective who's walked that case says the same thing: some crimes don't end, they just stop being recorded. The Thompson disappearance became one of those. Justice never arrived, but neither did forgetfulness. Across decades and continents, the same rhythm repeats: families who should have been safe behind locked doors, undone not by strangers, but by people who shared their tables. The Willingham girls in Texas, the Kahlers in Kansas, the Lundys in New Zealand, the Prosper family in England, the Thompsons in Chicago, all separate tragedies connected by a quiet thread. Each began as love that turned into control, or trust that hardened into faith in broken science, or institutions that mistook procedure for compassion. When investigators stepped back from the individual files and laid them side by side, a pattern emerged, so human, it hurt. Destruction grows easiest in the places we stop questioning. The Bureau's analysts called it the Domestic Familiarity Index, a study of murders committed inside relationships, where safety becomes weapon and privacy becomes camouflage. The numbers told one story, but the crime scene photos told another. Different cultures, same geometry: a hallway, a kitchen, a bed, a belief that tomorrow would look like today. The investigators who lived through these cases carried ghosts long after the files closed. One retired fire marshal in Texas admitted that every time he smelled smoke from a grill he thought of accelerant. A Kansas detective couldn't eat breakfast without seeing the outline of a rifle stock. An evidence tech in New Zealand stopped watching the news altogether. Trauma seeps into the profession, staining it invisible. Forensic reformers began to compare notes. They saw how each case exposed a flaw: science misused emotion, exploited oversight, delayed. They built conferences around those failures, trying to turn mourning into progress. New fire investigation protocols outlawed pattern-based arson theories. Crime labs adopted double-blind testing for biological evidence. Police academies introduced training on domestic coercion and post-separation violence. These were victories written in small print, earned through pain. Yet for every policy updated, another family somewhere still lived beneath the same unrecognized storm. Systems improve slowly. Grief doesn't wait. Sociologists studying these cases found a strange parallel in audience behavior. Each tragedy once televised became narrative therapy for strangers. Viewers cried then slept easier, believing evil had been contained, punished, understood. But the truth in these files refused containment. The stories were never about monsters lurking outside the house. They were about the fragile architecture of love and the blind spots in justice. The closer investigators looked, the more they saw ordinary people standing on the edge of extraordinary harm, unaware how thin the glass really was. In Chicago, Detective Leland's replacement reopened his notes one last time. In Austin, a journalist reread her article on Willingham and underlined the same sentence she'd written years earlier: "We were wrong because we wanted to be sure." In Wellington, a lab technician cleaned the same instruments that had once betrayed a man. In Luton, a police officer who'd searched the Prosper home couldn't bring himself to remove the children's drawings from evidence storage. He said they reminded him why procedure matters. Across the map, the rain fell differently, but meant the same thing: reminder and release. Patterns of behavior, forensic error, and emotional blindness merged into one tragic loop: the human tendency to see what we expect. Fires that looked like arson, husbands who looked like monsters, sons who looked like victims until they weren't. Every file told investigators the same lesson: truth demands patience, and patience is the first casualty of fear. By the early 2020s, academics began calling these connected cases the mirror crimes. Not serial, not copied, but reflective, each one forcing society to confront its own role in creating conditions for violence. The name stuck, panels were held, documentaries were made. Then quietly people moved on, yet the pattern never stopped. Because even as these stories closed, new reports were already crossing desks in another part of the world, cases that began in kindness and ended in blood. This time, the rain would fall in the Philippines, and the tragedy would unfold not from hatred, but from love twisted into envy. In North Cotabato, the night of April 17, 2021 began like any other in the Magwad household: quiet, humid, the generator humming under the porch. Inside, the family had finished dinner. The smell of rice and fried tilapia still lingered in the air. Pastor Joel Magwad and his wife Liza were washing dishes while their two youngest children, Christy and Joel Jr., folded laundry in the living room. Their adopted daughter Janice, 19, sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. At 9:31 p.m., she opened Facebook and typed something that would later freeze an entire community: "Help us. They're killing us." The post appeared publicly, no location tag, no context. Within minutes, friends began replying, asking if it was a joke. By the time police reached the remote property, the rain had started and the signal had died. The house was silent. When officers arrived near midnight, they found the front door unlocked, a trail of muddy footprints leading inside. The generator still ran. The scene that greeted them was both chaotic and careful. Furniture overturned, drawers open, but valuables untouched. Pastor Joel lay near the doorway with a head wound. His wife collapsed beside him, both beyond saving. Upstairs, the two children were found under blankets, their small hands entwined. The only survivor was Janice. She was discovered outside in the yard, trembling barefoot, her nightshirt smeared with blood. She told officers robbers had broken in, that she'd hidden under the bed and escaped through the window. Her story sounded rehearsed, but no one questioned a girl who'd just lost her family. The following morning, news spread through the province. Local radio replayed her social media post on air. Commenters called it prophetic, a digital scream from the grave. Reporters swarmed the hospital where she was treated for shock. She spoke softly, said she'd seen 3 men wearing masks, that they demanded money her father didn't have, that she'd begged them to stop. Detectives noted her composure: too calm, too linear for someone who'd witnessed slaughter. Still, trauma behaved strangely, and they wrote it off as dissociation. Forensics arrived from Davao City to process the scene. They found no forced entry, no footprints beyond family members, and no fingerprints on the weapon, a rusted steel pipe retrieved from the kitchen floor. Inside the master bedroom, a detective noticed something peculiar. A window latch was broken from the inside, not pried from out. The blood spatter pattern on the wall suggested the blows had come from someone standing between the victims and the door, not a stranger breaking in. In the bathroom, traces of diluted blood were found in the sink. Whoever had attacked the family had tried to clean up, but stopped halfway. On a towel hung neatly by the door, analysts found a single strand of long black hair matching Janice's profile. It wasn't enough to accuse, it was enough to whisper. Neighbors began remembering details they hadn't thought important. One said Janice had been arguing with her adoptive mother earlier that week about curfews and school fees. Another recalled seeing her with a teenage boy named Aldo, rumored to be her boyfriend, though she denied it. Police learned the Magwads had recently decided to revoke Janice's university allowance after discovering she dropped out months earlier. Financial stress, resentment, a secret relationship, all small seeds that grow into motive when watered by anger. Still, no one wanted to believe the girl who wrote that desperate message could be the same hand that held the weapon. Over the next days, investigators traced her phone activity. At 8:50 p.m., 40 minutes before the murders, she'd sent Aldo a message reading, "It's tonight, don't be late." He replied, "I'll wait by the road." She deleted the thread before officers arrived, but digital forensics recovered fragments from the device cache. It changed everything. When confronted, Janice insisted it was coincidence that they had planned to meet after her parents slept. The detectives listened quietly, recording every word. They noticed how she cried only when describing herself, never the others. They noticed how she referred to her adoptive family in past tense, as if distance provided comfort. By the end of the week, the police narrative had shifted. The robbery theory was abandoned. The case became domestic homicide, possible accomplice still at large. The Facebook post, once seen as a plea for help, now looked like misdirection, a performance crafted to delay suspicion. It was brilliant in its cruelty. The victim who wrote the warning had written it herself. And somewhere outside town, Aldo was still free, carrying the truth she thought she'd buried beneath the storm. By the second week of the investigation, the story that had first painted Janice Magwad as a victim had started to unravel thread by thread. Detectives from Cotabato City were called in to assist, bringing portable polygraphs, forensic kits, and the kind of patience small-town officers often lack. They began with a simple question: what time did the robbery start? Janice's answer changed with each interview. First she said 9:30, then closer to 10. When asked how long the ordeal lasted, she said minutes, then seconds, then whispered she couldn't remember. Trauma makes memory fragile, but her inconsistencies were too precise, like a rehearsed performance where the script kept evolving. The lead investigator, Captain Alonso, watched her closely. He'd seen shock, hysteria, and denial in survivors. Janice was something else, detached but controlled. During questioning, she referred to her adoptive parents as them instead of mama or papa. She corrected officers when they used her last name, saying it didn't feel like hers anymore. Each word widened the distance between guilt and grief. Alonso decided to recreate her timeline, using evidence rather than emotion. They reconstructed the night, minute-by-minute power on generator, running no sign of forced entry. The family must have opened the door willingly. The last outgoing call on Liza Magwad's phone came at 9:14, a routine message to a church volunteer confirming tomorrow's youth service. Within 15 minutes of that call, the first blows had landed. The forensics report from Davao arrived 3 days later. The steel pipe bore only one set of identifiable fingerprints, Janice's. She insisted she'd touched it days earlier while cleaning. The pattern of blood spatter on her shirt, however, contradicted her story. It wasn't random or accidental. It showed directionality consistent with a person standing over victims during assault. When confronted, she looked at the photographs without blinking. It must have splashed when I ran past them, she said quietly. The detective, studying her eyes, wrote in his notes, calculated composure, possible detachment from reality. Further analysis revealed that the Facebook post, "Help us, they're killing us," had been drafted hours before it went live. Metadata showed it was written at 6 p.m., saved as a draft and published automatically when she reconnected to Wi-Fi at 9:31. The timing eliminated the possibility that it was written during the attack. It had been planned. When Captain Alonso asked her why she hesitated, then said she'd written it just in case something bad happened. The phrasing made the air in the interrogation room feel colder. She wasn't predicting danger, she was manufacturing it. Investigators also found fresh scratches on her arms, not deep enough for defense wounds, but consistent with self-inflicted marks made by fingernails. Medical examiners confirmed the pattern. Alonso showed her the report. She shrugged. "I panicked," she said. "I wanted them to believe me." The word "them" hung in the air like confession. Still, police needed more, something irrefutable. They turned to her messages again, pulling deleted files from her phone's cache. Hidden among ordinary photos and memes was a video clip recorded the night before the murders. In it, she filmed herself whispering to someone off-screen, "Tomorrow we finish this." The voice replying was male, soft, hesitant. "Aldo." Officers arrested Aldo 2 days later in a nearby town. He was 17, thin, terrified. Under questioning, he cracked almost instantly. He said Janice had begged him to help scare her parents, that she'd promised it would just be a robbery, to make them apologize for choosing the church over her. When he refused, she told him it was already decided that if he didn't help, she'd do it alone. She'd stolen the pipe from behind the tool shed, hidden it under her bed, and chosen the night carefully when the rain would mask the noise. She wasn't scared, he said through tears. She was excited. Police verified his statement through chat logs. The last message from Janice, sent at 9:23 p.m., read, "I did it. It's over." 10 minutes later came the Facebook post. The timeline was complete. Every move had been orchestrated, not by impulse, but by intent. Alonso later told reporters that what disturbed him most wasn't the brutality, it was the rehearsal. She'd turned murder into theater and grief into script. When confronted with the evidence, Janice finally lowered her head. "I didn't want to kill them," she said. "I just wanted them to listen." Her trial would determine whether that distinction mattered. The evidence said no. The country watched, divided between pity and rage. Some called her a monster, others a victim of neglect. But in the end, neither label captured the full truth, that somewhere between love and resentment, a young woman rewrote the role of victim until it belonged to her alone. When Aldo finally agreed to cooperate, the interrogation room fell into the kind of stillness investigators call truth's first breath. He was pale, shaking eyes, darting toward the mirrored glass, as though waiting for Janice to appear on the other side. In a voice barely above a whisper, he said he hadn't meant for anyone to die. He had fallen in love with her, or at least with the version she allowed him to see. She told him her adoptive parents weren't human, that they were actors, spies, maybe demons. She said they'd taken her from her real family and forced her to live a lie. At first he laughed, but she never did. The more she talked, the more he believed she might be right. She could make ordinary things sound apocalyptic. Her language was hypnotic, half sermon, half performance. Detectives scrolled through the chat logs recovered from both phones. The messages began months before the killings, a steady rhythm of validation and despair. Janice wrote, "You're the only one who sees me. They think they own my soul." Aldo replied, "We can leave. Start over." She responded, "Not until I'm free." The word "free" repeated over 50 times across their conversation. When police analysts charted the timeline, they saw how her tone shifted in early April from victimhood to command. She began sending instructions: delete messages, avoid cameras, bring gloves. The digital record transformed from confession into coordination. Psychologists later described Janice's behavior as a rare combination of narcissistic fantasy and moral detachment traits, amplified by isolation and constant social media performance. Online, she curated herself as tragic heroine, posting poetry about betrayal, sharing photos captioned with scripture about vengeance. Followers sent sympathy, unaware they were feeding delusion. When her adoptive parents tried to restrict her internet use, she saw it as censorship of identity. Every rule became oppression, every kindness control. Aldo became both accomplice and audience, the only witness to her invented war. During one recorded session, Aldo wept as he described the hours before the murders. He said she'd called him at dusk, whispering that the house was ready. He thought she meant she'd finally confront her parents about leaving. When he refused to join her, she grew cold. "If you won't help," she said, "then you're part of the problem." He stayed home terrified. At 9:23, his phone buzzed the message that ended everything. "I did it. It's over." He showed the screen to investigators, crying that he'd tried to call, but she never answered. They believed him. His fingerprints were nowhere in the house. The guilt he carried was invisible but permanent. When Janice learned Aldo had confessed, she laughed. "He always talked too much," she said. She told detectives that he was weak, that she had only wanted to test his loyalty. But the tone changed when they read her own words aloud, the message, where she wrote, "After this we'll be famous. They'll make a movie." Her expression flickered, pride and fear colliding. She asked for a lawyer. The interviews stopped, but the story didn't. In court, prosecutors would later play the recordings, her calm voice guiding Aldo through imaginary heroism. "You'll be saving me. They deserve it. God understands." Experts said she displayed manipulation far beyond her age language, crafted to erase empathy from the boy who loved her. The juvenile psychologist assigned to evaluate her called the case unprecedented. Janice's intellect was high, her emotions selective. She could describe the texture of blood on her hands without flinching, but broke down when denied a mirror in her cell. She told the doctor she didn't hate her parents, they just stood in the way of what came next. When asked what that was, she smiled and said, "A story." To her, reality was a stage, and murder the act that gave it meaning. She referenced movies and internet videos where killers became icons. She said people remember stories, not rules. It was less confession than philosophy, one that chilled the courtroom when transcripts were read aloud. Aldo was sentenced to juvenile detention for accessory and obstruction, eligible for release at 21. He asked to be transferred out of the province, terrified she might find him again one day. Janice still legally a minor faced trial in family court under maximum jurisdiction. The hearings drew crowds who came not to mourn but to witness. In the hallways outside, parents held their children tighter. Reporters called her the girl who warned herself, a nickname that blurred irony and tragedy until they were indistinguishable. Each headline made her smirk. Attention was her final currency. As the trial prepared to begin, prosecutors assembled the last piece of the puzzle, a psychological profile that described not a monster but a mirror. It said Janice's greatest weapon wasn't violence, it was narrative. She rewrote truth until others spoke her lines. Even the Facebook post, now infamous, was part of that script, a message not of terror but authorship. She wanted to be the storyteller and the story, and in that she succeeded. The first day of Janice Magwad's trial felt less like justice and more like spectacle. Outside the courthouse in Kidapawan City, a crowd gathered under umbrellas, reporters shoulder to shoulder with townspeople, clutching handwritten signs, some demanding mercy, others calling her evil. Vendors sold bottled water and newspapers printed with her face. The headline read, "The Girl Who Cried Murder." Inside, cameras weren't allowed, but it hardly mattered. Every word would be transcribed, leaked, and dissected online by nightfall. What had begun as a family tragedy had become performance again, and Janice seemed to know it. She entered the courtroom wearing a pale blue blouse, provided by the detention center, her hair neatly braided, expression calm. When asked if she understood the charges, 3 counts of murder, 1 of attempted murder, she nodded. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady. The prosecutor, a veteran of domestic crime cases, began with the evidence: the pipe, the fingerprints, the metadata, the confession messages. Each piece of proof laid out like a mosaic of intent. The audience listened in silence until the video clip of her whispering, "Tomorrow we finish," this was played. Several people gasped. Janice didn't move. She simply tilted her head, studying the screen as though watching someone else. Her defense centered on diminished capacity. Psychologists testified that Janice had been raised in instability, had endured identity, confusion, and emotional neglect before adoption, and had struggled with mood disorders untreated for years. They described her as impressionable, detached, unable to grasp the finality of death. But the prosecution countered with precision, premeditation, manipulation, rehearsed alibis. "She didn't lose control," the prosecutor said. "She planned control and called it love." The statement echoed through the room like a verdict long before the jury retired. Aldo took the stand on the 4th day. He trembled so hard the microphone picked up the vibration of his breath. He said she promised they'd be legends, that she said fame was worth sin. He cried when asked if he loved her. "I did," he whispered. "I still dream about her telling me to smile." Janice watched him without expression until the judge ordered her to face forward. The courtroom filled with a silence heavier than judgment. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Outside, the internet turned the case into obsession. Hashtags carried her name across platforms. Amateur psychologists argued over her diagnosis. True crime channels uploaded speculative videos titled "Genius" or "Monster" clips of her police interviews leaked by an unknown source went viral. Viewers fixated on her calmness, her soft voice, her detached vocabulary. Some called her sociopathic, others saw intelligence misdirected by neglect. In the digital age, empathy and entertainment often trade places. The verdict arrived after 10 days of testimony. The judge declared her guilty of 3 counts of parricide and 1 of frustrated homicide. Because she was a minor at the time of the crime, the sentence would be served in a juvenile facility until she reached legal adulthood, after which the Department of Justice would determine further custody. The decision satisfied no one. Protesters outside shouted that the law was too soft. Advocates argued rehabilitation was the only moral option for a child who'd never been taught morality. Her lawyer said she accepted the ruling with understanding. She smiled faintly at that word, as if the phrasing itself were art. In her final statement before sentencing, Janice addressed the court directly. "I loved them," she said. "They just stopped hearing me." Her voice was soft, almost kind. "Sometimes you have to make noise to be remembered." The prosecutor called it the most chilling thing he'd ever heard. The judge struck the remark from the record, but it lived on in headlines and comment sections, copied, quoted, and stitched into videos until her words became detached from their horror. Months later, a film student released a short documentary about the case, pairing her recorded confession with dramatic reenactments. It won awards for emotional realism. Social media hailed it as art. Critics called it exploitation. Somewhere inside a rehabilitation facility, Janice watched it on a small television and laughed. "I told you," she said, "to no one people remember stories." She wasn't wrong. The tragedy of the Magwad family had become content, consumed, and forgotten in the same breath. For investigators, it was proof that justice in the digital age doesn't end with a gavel, it echoes endlessly in pixels and views. In the months after the verdict, the Magwad case refused to fade. It seeped into legislative halls, classrooms, and Sunday sermons, igniting debates about guilt, age, and the limits of rehabilitation. Lawmakers in Manila opened committee hearings on juvenile liability, televised live and watched like sport. Parents of victims sat in the gallery beside advocates for children's rights, both sides clutching photographs, one of the dead, the other of the condemned. The nation found itself staring into a mirror and arguing over the reflection. How young is too young for evil? How old must a person be before remorse becomes mandatory? Senator Yannaris, gray-haired and deliberate, spoke first. "We cannot keep pretending monsters are born at 18, she said, referencing Janice without using her name. She called for an amendment to lower the age of criminal responsibility from 15 to 12, citing rising youth violence. Across the aisle, Senator Santos countered with fury. "Lowering the age won't raise our humanity," he said. "It will only prove we learned nothing from tragedy." The exchange lasted hours, broadcast in real time, accompanied by scrolling comments from viewers who typed judgments between lunch breaks. The audience wanted closure the way people crave a final act in a long film. But this story had no neat ending. In North Cotabato, the Magwad's surviving relatives visited the family's graves every Sunday. The tomb sat under a mango tree, its branches now heavy with fruit. Liza's sister said she still couldn't forgive not Janice, not the system that let her call herself victim again on television. She said the law spoke of rehabilitation, but no one rehabilitated the dead. Nearby, Aldo's mother left flowers, 2 whispering prayers for both children. The same rain fell on both sets of mourners, blurring the boundary between vengeance and mercy. Grief had no allegiance. It soaked everyone the same. At the juvenile facility, Janice began classes in creative writing. She filled notebooks with short stories about imaginary families who loved each other perfectly, then destroyed themselves. The instructors praised her talent. "She's articulate," one counselor said. "She understands empathy intellectually." When asked about her progress, Janice smiled and said she'd learned that every villain believes they're the main character. Her words unsettled the staff. They couldn't tell if she meant it as reflection or warning. Meanwhile, lawmakers pressed forward. The House Committee on Justice released a report acknowledging failures: underfunded mental health services, poor coordination between schools and social workers, outdated laws treating trauma as afterthought. Buried in the appendix was a quiet recommendation: strengthen early intervention programs rather than harsher sentencing. It was the closest thing to a victory compassion had won in years. But outside the building, a crowd still shouted for retribution. The idea that a teenage girl could commit such horror and still be called redeemable felt intolerable to many. Forgiveness is an act of imagination, and imagination is often the first casualty of grief. Television anchors replayed segments from the trial on anniversaries, each time pairing them with commentary about the moral decay of youth. Talk shows invited priests, psychologists, influencers. Each offered theories, none offered peace. Ratings climbed. The Magwad family's tragedy became shorthand for societal failure, a cautionary tale wielded by every side to prove their point. Somewhere beneath the noise, the question remained unanswered. Who failed first, the girl who killed, or the world that watched her drown in silence until she screamed through blood? In Davao, Captain Alonzo retired quietly, his desk emptied except for a single photograph from the case file, the screenshot of Janice's Facebook post. He kept it not as evidence, but as reminder of how fragile truth becomes when filtered through screens. The moment it went viral, he told a colleague, it stopped being a cry for help. It became entertainment. He donated the file to a police academy training program on digital criminology, hoping future investigators would learn the difference. That same night, heavy rain swept across the province, tapping against the courthouse windows where lawmakers debated late into the evening. The session ended without a vote. One senator stood by the doorway, staring into the downpour, saying softly, "Maybe punishment is just our way of pretending we can undo what's already done." No one responded. The sound of thunder filled the silence. Across continents, the rain kept falling. In Texas, it slid down the courthouse windows where Cameron Todd Willingham's name was finally cleared by science, but not by time. In Kansas, it soaked the ground above the Kaler graves where a boy once testified against the father he still called Dad. In New Zealand, it traced rivulets through the cemetery, where Christine and Amber Lundy rested beneath one headstone carved with the words "Forever Together." In England, it streaked across the polished marble outside the Luton courthouse, where candles burned for Juliana and her children. In Chicago, it gathered in the cracks of a forgotten basement floor once scrubbed with bleach. In the Philippines, it washed through the mango grove, where the Magwad's tombs sat side by side, small petals floating like fragile evidence. Each drop carried the same story, told 6 different ways: trust betrayed truth, delayed justice, fractured. Investigators from different generations began to recognize the rhythm linking their files. Every case had started with a belief that safety existed somewhere, that institutions would intervene, that love would protect. Yet each ended in failure of system, of science, of perception. The Willingham fire taught them how arrogance could disguise itself as expertise. The Kaler massacre showed how control dressed itself as care. The Lundy conviction revealed the danger of mistaking confidence for proof. The Prosper murders exposed the algorithmic abyss where loneliness becomes ideology. The Thompson disappearance illustrated how silence can bury truth deeper than earth. And the Magwad tragedy forced the world to admit that even compassion can curdle into cruelty when envy wears the face of family. Together they formed an unintentional atlas of human error, mapped across rain-soaked soil. Forensic conferences began citing them collectively as the 6 mirrors. Each reflected a flaw society preferred not to see. Panels discussed investigative bias, media exploitation, and emotional fatigue among officers. But in quieter corners of those gatherings, the conversation turned personal. Fire analysts spoke of nightmares filled with smoke and cries they couldn't silence. Detectives described guilt that outlived retirement. Journalists confessed the shame of turning suffering into narrative. True crime, they agreed, was never really about monsters. It was about the thin, trembling line between curiosity and voyeurism. One investigator in Wellington said something that lingered. Evidence doesn't lie, but people interpret lies into evidence. That sentence circled through departments worldwide, printed on training slides, quoted in lectures. It became a mantra for the new generation of forensic scientists who vowed never to confuse certainty with truth. They studied these 6 cases as cautionary parables, each one a reminder that facts are fragile and emotions heavier than proof. When students examined the files, they found connections not of method but of meaning. Every tragedy began the same way, with someone ignored until it was too late. In documentary studios and courtrooms alike, the stories intertwined. Producers spliced footage of burned homes with courtroom sketches, overlaying thunder to dramatize what reality had already made unbearable. Viewers watched, cried, and then slept easier, comforted by the illusion that evil had been contained inside those screens. But outside, under the same rain, new families argued, new scientists tested, new journalists wrote proof that the cycle never stops. Each retelling became another echo in an unending conversation between grief and fascination. The victims, though, separated by oceans and decades, now existed side by side in memory. Their names appeared together in an exhibit titled Evidence of Absence, a traveling installation displaying photographs of empty rooms, a nursery, a courtroom, a church hall, a basement. No blood, no bodies, just space once occupied by love. Visitors described it as haunting, though nothing inside was violent. The curator said it was meant to remind people that the worst crimes aren't always visible. They're felt in the silences that follow. When the exhibition reached Austin, rain battered the roof of the museum. A child pressed her palm against the glass case, holding a melted toy car from the Willingham home. Her mother whispered, "That used to be somebody's." The child nodded, then asked, "Do they still hurt?" Her mother answered softly, "Only when we forget." Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating puddles that reflected every tragedy at once. The storms were different, but the water was the same. Across continents, the rain kept falling. In Texas, it slid down the courthouse windows, where Cameron Todd Willingham's name was finally cleared by science, but not by time. In Kansas, it soaked the ground above the Kaler graves, where a boy once testified against the father he still called Dad. In New Zealand, it traced rivulets through the cemetery where Christine and Amber Lundy rested beneath one headstone carved with the words, "Forever Together." In England, it streaked across the polished marble outside the Luton courthouse, where candles burned for Juliana and her children. In Chicago, it gathered in the cracks of a forgotten basement floor once scrubbed with bleach. In the Philippines, it washed through the mango grove, where the Magwad's tombs sat side by side, small petals floating like fragile evidence. Each drop carried the same story, told 6 different ways: trust betrayed, truth delayed, justice fractured. Investigators from different generations began to recognize the rhythm linking their files. Every case had started with a belief that safety existed somewhere, that institutions would intervene, that love would protect. Yet each ended in failure of system, of science, of perception. The Willingham fire taught them how arrogance could disguise itself as expertise. The Kaler massacre showed how control dressed itself as care. The Lundy conviction revealed the danger of mistaking confidence for proof. The Prosper murders exposed the algorithmic abyss, where loneliness becomes ideology. The Thompson disappearance illustrated how silence can bury truth deeper than earth. And the Magwad tragedy forced the world to admit that even compassion can curdle into cruelty when envy wears the face of family. Together they formed an unintentional atlas of human error mapped across rain-soaked soil. Forensic conferences began citing them collectively as the 6 mirrors. Each reflected a flaw society preferred not to see. Panels discussed investigative bias, media exploitation, and emotional fatigue among officers. But in quieter corners of those gatherings, the conversation turned personal. Fire analysts spoke of nightmares filled with smoke and cries they couldn't silence. Detectives described guilt that outlived retirement. Journalists confessed the shame of turning suffering into narrative. True crime, they agreed, was never really about monsters. It was about the thin, trembling line between curiosity and voyeurism. One investigator in Wellington said something that lingered. Evidence doesn't lie, but people interpret lies into evidence. That sentence circled through departments worldwide, printed on training slides, quoted in lectures. It became a mantra for the new generation of forensic scientists who vowed never to confuse certainty with truth. They studied these 6 cases as cautionary parables, each one a reminder that facts are fragile and emotions heavier than proof. When students examined the files, they found connections not of method but of meaning. Every tragedy began the same way, with someone ignored until it was too late. In documentary studios and courtrooms alike, the stories intertwined. Producers spliced footage of burned homes with courtroom sketches overlaying thunder to dramatize what reality had already made unbearable. Viewers watched, cried, and then slept easier, comforted by the illusion that evil had been contained inside those screens. But outside, under the same rain, new families argued, new scientists tested, new journalists wrote proof that the cycle never stops. Each retelling became another echo in an unending conversation between grief and fascination. The victims, though separated by oceans and decades, now existed side by side in memory. Their names appeared together in an exhibit titled Evidence of Absence, a traveling installation displaying photographs of empty rooms, a nursery, a courtroom, a church hall, a basement. No blood, no bodies, just space once occupied by love. Visitors described it as haunting, though nothing inside was violent. The curator said it was meant to remind people that the worst crimes aren't always visible, they're felt in the silences that follow. When the exhibition reached Austin, rain battered the roof of the museum. A child pressed her palm against the glass case, holding a melted toy car from the Willingham home. Her mother whispered, "That used to be somebody's." The child nodded, then asked, "Do they still hurt?" Her mother answered softly, "Only when we forget." Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating puddles that reflected every tragedy at once. The storms were different, but the water was the same. Years after the headlines faded, what remained were the people who had to live in the quiet. Survivors, neighbors, first responders, and families who still woke to the same ache each morning. They weren't the names that appeared in documentaries or court transcripts. They were the ones who stayed behind, piecing themselves together in fragments. In Kansas, Sean Kaler turned 30 and worked as a mechanic, keeping his last name but never saying it aloud. He said engines made sense. They could be rebuilt, their failures visible. People, he said, weren't that simple. He still dreamed of his sisters sometimes, but the dreams had lost sound. That's when you know you're healing, his therapist told him. He wasn't sure she was right. In Texas, Stacy Kuykendall lived a life of near invisibility. She avoided interviews after the final report confirmed that Cameron Todd Willingham's conviction had been flawed beyond repair. She never declared belief or disbelief in his innocence. Either way, she once told a reporter, "I lost everything." The world had chosen sides for her long ago. She'd stopped explaining. When asked if she forgave, she said forgiveness was just another word for exhaustion. Across the ocean, Mark Lundy lived alone in a small flat outside Wellington. He didn't attend the memorials anymore. He said they felt like plays repeating the same script. He spent his days repairing old bicycles, hands busy with something that didn't argue back. Reporters still called, but he stopped answering. "I used to think justice meant balance," he wrote in a letter later published anonymously. "Now I think it means endurance. You keep standing until the world forgets why you were on trial." In England, teachers at St. Joseph's Primary School planted trees in the playground, one for each child spared by the arrest of Nicholas Prosper. The roots stretched deep, but the fear remained shallow underfoot. Morning drills now included lockdown training. The children called it the quiet game, not understanding its origin. For them, safety was learned, not assumed. Some nights, parents gathered outside the school gates just watching. They said it helped to see lights still on in the classrooms, proof that life went on. Chicago's detectives built a small display in the precinct hallway dedicated to the Thompson family. It contained nothing but photocopies of the missing posters and a single quote from the lead investigator. Justice isn't always proof, sometimes it's remembrance. New recruits passed it every morning, hardly noticing until their first homicide made the words real. The file remained unsolved, but never forgotten. Even in death, Kenneth White's suicide had denied them closure. Yet, in its absence, the case taught generations of officers the one thing their manuals never mentioned, that some truths are too human for evidence to measure. In the Philippines, survivors of domestic violence began gathering at the Magwad family church each April. They lit candles, shared stories, and spoke of warning signs ignored. Liza's sister led the service, ending each year with the same prayer, for every child unseen until it's too late. The facility holding Janice refused public comment, citing privacy laws, but staff members said she wrote letters to her counselor, describing dreams of rain that smelled like smoke. They didn't know if it was guilt or imagination, maybe both. Community voices filled the spaces left by the dead. Journalists who once chased ratings now ran workshops on ethical storytelling. Detectives became mentors, teaching empathy before procedure. Scientists used these cases to argue for transparency over speed. Slowly, small changes rooted in grief began to grow. In conferences, they called it applied compassion. In everyday life, it was just learning to listen before judging. But the survivors themselves carried the hardest lesson. Healing isn't a conclusion, it's maintenance. Sean still visited the cemetery on cloudy days, because sunlight made it too normal. Stacy sometimes left flowers at a grave she wasn't sure marked a murderer or a martyr. Teachers in Luton rehearsed lockdowns and told students to stay quiet, even though silence was what let violence grow in the first place. Across oceans, the rain fell the same way, on each of them uniting what tragedy had divided. No one called it closure anymore. They called it survival. The difference mattered. Closure meant the story ended. Survival meant it kept breathing through the people who refused to let memory fade. And in that stubborn persistence, perhaps justice lived not in verdicts or prisons, but in the quiet decision to remember the ones who never got to speak for themselves. When the noise finally faded, the second wave began the quieter work of people who wanted to fix what had broken. In Austin, the same journalist who first questioned Cameron Todd Willingham's arson conviction now sat on a national review board for forensic reliability. She no longer chased headlines, she audited science. Her task was to evaluate old convictions built on discredited methods. The first time she walked into the archive, she said it felt like entering a graveyard made of paper. Each folder held a life derailed by confidence masquerading as fact. She kept one reminder pinned above her desk. Doubt is discipline, not weakness. Across the Atlantic, forensic researchers in New Zealand published a study re-examining the molecular techniques once used against Mark Lundy. They traced the chain of custody, replicated the mRNA tests, and found contamination so severe it rendered all earlier conclusions meaningless. The report used sterile language, but its implications were raw science had been twisted into storytelling. When reporters asked Mark if he felt vindicated, he shook his head. "Vindication doesn't bring back time," he said, "but maybe it stops someone else from losing theirs." His words became the introduction to the next commission on forensic integrity. In London, criminologists launched the Mirror Project, inspired by cross-case analysis of false or fractured justice. They built a global database linking wrongful convictions, domestic homicides, and juvenile crimes that shared similar systemic flaws. The goal wasn't blame, it was pattern recognition to catch the next collapse before it happened. Each year, new nations joined. By 2025, over 100 cases had been flagged for review. Behind the statistics were small victories. Men freed after decades, women exonerated posthumously, families given apologies that felt like whispers but mattered anyway. Every correction came too late for someone, but never too late for learning. Meanwhile, a new generation of journalists began asking different questions. Instead of who killed, they asked, why did we believe? Podcasts replaced sensational reenactments with slow, thoughtful storytelling, blending empathy with investigation. The public appetite shifted slightly from shock to understanding. One program, Rain Witnesses, dedicated each episode to a single piece of forensic evidence misinterpreted in the past 50 years. Its tagline was simple: proof can lie too. It became required listening for law students and detectives in training. Scientists, humbled by years of errors, began building transparency into the lab process. Every forensic report now included a probability score, a written acknowledgement of uncertainty. The change frustrated prosecutors but protected truth. Training manuals were rewritten to emphasize replication, not speed. "Better a late truth than a quick lie," one instructor said. In classrooms, students learned that justice wasn't a straight line, it was a map drawn in pencil, constantly revised. The Willingham fire was now case number 1 in that syllabus, a warning printed in bold: never mistake heat for intent. In the Philippines, Captain Alonso's final act before retirement was helping launch a digital evidence task force to monitor online threats among at-risk youth. The program flagged posts like Janice's Facebook message long before violence could unfold. Its success rate wasn't perfect, but even one life saved justified its existence. Alonso called it redemption through vigilance. "You can't erase ghosts," he said, "but you can build better fences." Across these stories, optimism came in small increments. One law amended, one lab corrected, one family finally believed. The rain that once symbolized tragedy began to mean persistence, the steady washing of errors that refused to stay buried. In memorial lectures and university halls, survivors spoke beside scientists, sharing stages once reserved for experts. Their presence reminded audiences that data without empathy is just math. The balance between reason and compassion became the new definition of justice. Late one evening, the journalist from Austin wrote her final editorial. "Maybe justice isn't a verdict," she said. "Maybe it's the willingness to reopen the file." She pressed send, listened to the soft patter of rain on her window, and thought of every name she'd written about the innocent, the guilty, the forgotten. Somewhere, another reporter was just beginning their first story, trying to make sense of the same endless loop. And that, she realized, was the closest humanity could come to closure, not silence but continuity. The rain hasn't stopped. It moves across timelines and continents, falling on ashes, courthouses, and empty chairs. I've told you 6 stories, but they were never really separate. Each name, each place, each moment of silence after a verdict, they all belong to the same archive of human fragility. When you examine these cases long enough, something happens. The line between storyteller and witness begins to blur. You start to feel the weight of every file you open, every photograph you can't unsee. You realize that true crime isn't about monsters, it's about mirrors, and every mirror eventually reflects you. I've read transcripts where science spoke louder than mercy, and others where mercy drowned truth. I've seen evidence tagged, boxed, forgotten, rediscovered years later by hands trembling with guilt. I've watched survivors grow old in anonymity while strangers profit from their pain. Sometimes the most haunting thing isn't what the killer did, it's what everyone else allowed. The neighbor who didn't knock, the expert who didn't question, the juror who didn't doubt. The storyteller who didn't pause to ask if another retelling would wound someone all over again. When we speak about justice, we talk about balance, but balance implies 2 sides equal in weight. These stories prove it's rarely that simple. Justice often leans toward whoever shouts first, then steadies only when the quiet voices refuse to stop. A mother writing letters to a governor, a reporter reopening a case file, a detective whispering an apology to a photograph. The effort to make wrong things less wrong never ends. Maybe that's the point, it shouldn't. There are moments during these narratives when emotion must break through the forensic shell, because data alone cannot explain why people destroy what they love. Fire experts can describe heat transfer. They can't describe the cold that follows a false conviction. Ballistics can map the flight of a bullet. They can't trace the shockwave through a child's lifetime. Algorithms can detect warning signs in online behavior, but not the loneliness that plants them. Every discipline stops at the edge of empathy, and that's where storytelling begins. Not to sensationalize, but to remind us that empathy itself is a kind of evidence. If you listen closely, the 6 stories hum in unison. The Willingham fire whispers about arrogance disguised as knowledge. The Kaler tragedy warns of love warped into ownership. The Lundy ordeal shows how certainty can be deadly. The Prosper case screams about digital isolation breeding chaos. The Thompson disappearance mourns silence heavier than proof. The Magwad murders reveal how attention itself can become an accomplice. Together they form a sentence written in rainwater. We keep making the same mistakes because we keep forgetting they're ours. There's a quiet kind of courage that exists in those who stay after the scientists who admit error, the officers who change training manuals, the families who tell their stories not for fame but for warning. They build light piece by piece, not to erase the darkness, but to prove we can still see through it. I've walked through these stories long enough to understand that evil rarely arrives as thunder. It arrives as habit, neglect, misplaced trust, a glance turned away. And every time it does, the world loses something we'll never measure. Now the files are closed again but not locked. The rain outside is steady, the same rhythm that opened this long night. Somewhere a listener is lying awake, the sound against the window, reminding them of another story, another family, another moment when truth faltered but refused to die. Maybe you're that listener. Maybe that's why you stayed through all of it, not for horror but for understanding. If there's one thing these cases share, it's this: people fail, but evidence endures, and compassion must evolve faster than cruelty. So keep the light low, keep the door locked, and remember, the rain doesn't mourn, it remembers. Good evening again. If you're still here, you've walked through 30 parts of darkness with me. You've listened to storms that crossed borders and decades to lives burned, broken, forgotten, or forgiven. The stories are finished now, but the quiet that follows isn't silence, it's space. Space for breath, for thought, for the slow work of compassion that outlives anger. True crime often ends with a gavel, a sentence, a statistic, but real endings rarely sound like that. They sound like rain easing against a window, like the breath someone finally takes after holding it for years. Tonight, the victims belong to memory, not evidence. 3 small girls asleep under Christmas lights. A mother and daughters trying to leave before control turned lethal. A wife and child whose last evening began with dinner and ended with science pretending to know certainty. A family who never made it to morning because a boy believed violence could make him seen. A household erased in bleach and denial. Parents and children slain by a girl who mistook attention for love. They aren't characters. They were people who trusted, laughed, and lived until someone decided their story was over. Remember them not as cautionary tales, but as reminders of how fragile ordinary life can be. Justice came unevenly, sometimes late, sometimes never. It wore different faces: a governor's regret, a child's forgiveness, a scientist's apology, a mother's prayer. The systems meant to protect them failed, but each failure left a blueprint for change. If the law is a structure, compassion is its electricity, useless unless it flows. Every reform, every training manual, every lecture that begins with "we were wrong" is a quiet act of redemption. It doesn't erase pain, but it proves we can still evolve toward decency. You've heard me say that rain connects everything. It falls on graves and courthouses, on homes rebuilt where tragedy began. It carries the same salt as tears, the same rhythm as confession. In these stories, rain was witness and wash, reminder and release. It has no side, no verdict. It only falls steady, patient, indifferent, until the world decides what to learn from it. Maybe that's what healing is: not forgetting, but learning to live beneath the sound of what can't be undone. If you're listening now, wherever you are, in a car, on a bed, half asleep under the weight of the world, know this: the stories were never about death. They were about survival. About how people keep getting up, even when truth feels heavier than guilt. About how empathy, once awakened, becomes impossible to unlearn. The next time you see a headline or a clip or a stranger's sorrow turned into entertainment, pause. Ask yourself whether watching is the same as witnessing. Ask whether silence can be its own form of justice. The world is quieter when we listen deeply. That's how remembrance begins, not in noise but in choice. Each listener becomes a keeper of light for someone who no longer has one. That's what you've been tonight, a witness not to horror but to humanity. And though the storm still hums outside, though another file waits in another drawer, it's all right to rest now. The rain will take the watch for a while. Another file waits, but tonight leave the light on for them.